The autumn wind swept across the Kansas plains, bending the wheat like waves on a golden ocean that had forgotten how to produce. The drought had lasted 5 months now, the worst in half a century, and as Nathan Garrett's rental sedan crossed into Riley County, he could see the evidence of devastation in every direction. Abandoned tractors sat like monuments to failed dreams. Foreclosure signs dotted properties that had sustained families for generations. The land itself seemed to be dying, and Nate wondered if his grandfather had chosen the cruelest possible moment to finally let go. Colonel James Garrett had died 3 days ago at the age of 82, his heart simply stopping while he sat in his favorite chair on the front porch of the farmhouse where 4 generations of Garretts had been born. The funeral was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, and Nate was running late, having caught a red-eye from Washington, D.C., where he worked as an agricultural policy analyst for the Department of Agriculture. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days in air-conditioned offices writing reports about rural farming communities, while the community that had raised him crumbled without him. The Garrett farm appeared on the horizon like something from a sepia photograph, all weathered wood and faded paint against the endless sky. 280 acres of wheat and sorrow, purchased by Nate's great-great-grandfather in 1891, with money saved from 10 years of backbreaking work on the railroad. The white farmhouse stood 3 stories tall, built from Kansas limestone with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern corner where the foundation had settled over the decades. The red barn behind it was even older, a cathedral of timber and tradition that had sheltered livestock through blizzards, tornadoes, and the slow erosion of the family's fortunes. Nate pulled into the gravel driveway and killed the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. Through the dusty windshield, he could see vehicles already lined up along the fence line. His brother Sam's mud-splattered pickup truck, Vernon Mitchell's ancient Ford from the neighboring property, at least a dozen others belonging to farmers and townspeople who had known the colonel for longer than Nate had been alive. He checked his reflection in the rear-view mirror, straightening the tie he'd worn to show respect, though he knew his grandfather would have mocked him for the city boy affectation. The last time Nate had seen James Garrett alive was 3 months ago, a brief weekend visit in June that had been more duty than desire. He'd found his grandfather in the equipment shed, tinkering with some rusted piece of machinery that looked like it belonged in a museum. The old man had barely acknowledged Nate's arrival, his attention focused on the gears and levers of whatever antique he was restoring. "You look tired, Grandpa," Nate had said, trying to start a conversation. James had glanced up briefly, his blue eyes still sharp despite the web of wrinkles that surrounded them. "Tired of watching good men lose their farms while bureaucrats in Washington write reports about it." The words had stung because they were meant to, and Nate had retreated to safer topics, discussing weather and crops with the careful distance of someone who no longer truly understood either. But as Nate had been preparing to leave that Sunday afternoon, his grandfather had walked him to the car, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was beginning to betray him. "Nathan," the colonel had said, using his grandson's full name the way he always did when something important needed to be said. "Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't land, it's knowing what's worth fighting for." Nate had nodded politely, assuming this was another lecture about abandoning the farm for a government job. But James had gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. "Remember the 53 tiller," he'd continued, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "What's broken can be fixed if you know where to dig." Before Nate could ask what that meant, his grandfather had turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him standing beside his rental car with a vague sense that he'd missed something crucial. Now, 3 months later, those words echoed in his mind as he climbed out of the sedan and walked toward the farmhouse where his grandfather's body waited in a casket he'd probably paid for with money that should have gone to fixing the irrigation system. The house was full of people, their voices a low murmur of condolence and memory that seemed to absorb all the air in the rooms. Nate recognized most of them. Vernon Mitchell, 77 years old and looking like he'd been carved from the same limestone as the farmhouse, stood in the corner talking to a group of weathered farmers. Helen Parker, his grandfather's former student, who'd gone on to become a professor at Kansas State, sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. And there, standing by the casket with his back to the door, was Samuel Garrett, Nate's older brother, the son who had stayed when Nate had left. Sam was 35 now, Though he could have passed for 40, the Kansas sun had turned his skin to leather and carved lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting at distant horizons and machinery that broke at the worst possible moments. He wore the same clothes he probably wore every day: Wrangler jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms thick with muscle and scarred from barbed wire and sheet metal. He looked, Nate thought, with an uncomfortable pang of something like envy, exactly like their grandfather had at that age. Sam must have sensed Nate's presence because he turned slowly, and for a moment the brothers locked eyes across the crowded room. There was no warmth in Sam's gaze, no relief that family had arrived to share the burden of grief, just a kind of weary assessment, as if he were looking at a tractor that had been sitting unused in a shed for too long and trying to decide if it was worth the effort to get it running again. "You made it," Sam said finally, his voice flat and noncommittal. "I caught the first flight I could," Nate replied, hating how defensive he sounded. Sam nodded once, then turned back to the casket without another word, and Nate understood that this was the shape their relationship had taken over the years. Not hostile exactly, but hollowed out by distance and decisions that had seemed small at the time, but had accumulated into an unbridgeable divide. Sam had stayed to work the land while Nate had gone to Michigan State to study agricultural science, and somehow that choice had marked Nate as an outsider, someone who'd chosen books over dirt and theory over the brutal reality of farming. The funeral service was held at the First Methodist Church in town, a white clapboard building that had been standing since 1882 and still smelled of wood polish and old hymnals. Pastor Reynolds, who'd baptized both Nate and Sam, delivered a eulogy that painted James Garrett as a pillar of the community, a veteran who'd served his country in Korea and then served his neighbors for 60 years with quiet dignity and an open hand. He spoke of the colonel's generosity, the way he'd helped struggling farmers with equipment loans and advice, the way he'd been the first to show up when someone's barn burned or their livestock got loose. What the pastor didn't mention, because perhaps he didn't know, was the way James Garrett had become something of a recluse in his final years, spending long hours alone in the equipment shed or walking the fence lines at dawn when most men his age would still be asleep. He didn't talk about the locked room in the basement that no one was allowed to enter, or the way the colonel would sometimes disappear for days at a time without explanation. These were the mysteries that had accumulated around James Garrett like dust in an attic, noticed but not examined, accepted as the eccentricities of a man who'd earned the right to his privacy. The cemetery sat on a low hill overlooking the town, its headstones arranged in rough chronological order from the original settlers to the recent dead. The Garrett family plot occupied a choice spot near an old cottonwood tree, and it was there that they lowered Colonel James Garrett into the ground between his wife Margaret, who died of cancer in 1992, and his son Daniel, Nate, and Sam's father, who'd been killed in a farm accident 18 years ago when Nate was just 12 years old. Nate watched his father's headstone as the pastor said the final prayers, remembering the way Daniel Garrett had died, a machinery accident, the police had said. His father had been working alone on the combine harvester, and somehow he'd gotten caught in the mechanism. By the time Sam found him, it was already too late. The official report had called it operator error, a tragic reminder of how dangerous farm equipment could be. But Nate remembered his grandfather's face at that funeral. The way James had stared at the casket was something that looked less like grief and more like guilt. The crowd at the graveside was larger than Nate had expected. More than 200 people showed up to pay their respects, farmers and shopkeepers and people from 3 counties over who'd known the colonel in one capacity or another. They lined up after the service to shake Sam's hand and offer condolences, and Nate found himself standing slightly apart, acknowledged with polite nods but clearly understood to be the grandson who'd left, the one who'd chosen a different path. Vernon Mitchell was one of the last to approach, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints had been worn down by 7 decades of hard labor. He shook Sam's hand first, then turned to Nate with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Your grandfather was a good man, Nathan," Vernon said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "One of the best I've known." "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," Nate replied. "I know you two were close." Vernon nodded slowly, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice so the people around them wouldn't hear. "He wasn't just a farmer, your grandpa. There was more to him than folks knew, more than most could understand." Before Nate could ask what that meant, Vernon had moved on, leaving him standing there with questions that had no one left alive to answer them. The crowd dispersed slowly, vehicles pulling away in procession down the dirt road that led back to town, and eventually only Nate and Sam remained, standing on opposite sides of their grandfather's grave like bookends holding up a story neither of them fully understood. "We need to meet with the lawyer tomorrow," Sam said finally, breaking the silence. "Sullivan wants to read the will at 10 o'clock. "I'll be there," Nate assured him. Sam nodded, then started walking toward his truck without another word, and Nate watched him go, wondering when exactly his brother had become a stranger. That night, Nate stayed in his childhood bedroom on the second floor of the farmhouse, a space that had remained frozen in time like some kind of agricultural museum. His old FFA jacket still hung in the closet. Ribbons from the county fair were pinned to a corkboard above the desk where he'd done his homework. Even the bed was the same, a twin mattress with a quilt his grandmother had made before she died. Its pattern of interlocking rings faded but still intact. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and the wind rattling the windows in their frames. At some point past midnight, Nate gave up and went downstairs to the kitchen, thinking he might make coffee and sit on the porch the way his grandfather used to do. But as he passed through the living room, he noticed a light coming from beneath the door to the basement, and he realized Sam must still be awake. Nate hesitated, then opened the door and descended the wooden stairs into the cool darkness below. The basement had been divided into sections over the years: a root cellar where his grandmother had stored preserves, a workshop where his father had built furniture during the long winters, and at the far end, behind a heavy oak door, the room his grandfather had kept locked for as long as Nate could remember. Sam was standing in front of that locked door, his hand resting on the handle as if he were trying to decide whether to open it. He didn't turn when Nate reached the bottom of the stairs, but his posture shifted slightly, acknowledging his brother's presence. "Did he ever tell you what he kept in there?" Nate asked quietly. "Tools," Sam replied. "Old equipment, nothing important." But the way he said it, the slight hesitation before the words, told Nate his brother was lying. Not maliciously, perhaps, but definitely withholding something. Before Nate could press the issue, Sam had turned and walked past him, climbing the stairs without explanation and leaving Nate alone in the basement with more questions than answers. The law office of Robert Sullivan occupied a modest brick building on Main Street in town, sandwiched between a hardware store and a diner that had been serving the same breakfast menu since 1947. Sullivan himself was in his early 60s, a man who'd handled legal matters for most of the farming families in the county and had the kind of practiced sympathy that came from delivering bad news on a regular basis. Foreclosures and bankruptcies and estate settlements that left families fractured over who got the land and who got the debt. The reading of the will took place in a conference room that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Sam arrived first, dressed in the same clothes he'd worn to the funeral, and took a seat on one side of the long table. Nate arrived exactly on time, a habit from his government job, and sat across from his brother. The space between them felt larger than the width of the table. Sullivan entered carrying a manila folder and a leather-bound ledger that looked older than the building itself. He settled into his chair with the gravity of someone about to perform a sacred duty, then opened the folder and began reading in the formal language of legal documents. "The will had been executed 6 months ago," Sullivan explained, "properly witnessed and notarized, representing Colonel James Garrett's final wishes for the disposition of his estate." And then came the words that would change everything. To his grandson, Samuel Garrett, James left the entirety of the farm, all 280 acres, the farmhouse and its contents, the barn and equipment shed, the livestock and machinery, and the contents of his bank accounts. Everything that represented the accumulated wealth and work of 6 generations, handed over in a single paragraph of legalese. To his grandson, Nathan Garrett, James left the sum of $15,000 and one item from the equipment shed, a 1953 John Deere tiller that had been sitting unused in the corner for the past 40 years, its frame rusted and its mechanism seized from decades of neglect. Sullivan finished reading and looked up, perhaps expecting protest or tears or some dramatic reaction. But Nate just sat there feeling like he'd been hit in the chest with something heavy and cold. Not because he'd expected half the farm or thought he deserved it. He'd left, after all, chosen a different path, and there was a certain logic to giving everything to the son who'd stayed. But the tiller, that specific, deliberate choice, felt like a message he couldn't decode, a final statement from his grandfather that made no sense at all. There's a personal note as well, Sullivan added, pulling a sealed envelope from the folder. Colonel Garrett instructed me to give this to Nathan directly. Nate took the envelope with hands that had started to shake slightly. His name was written on the front in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Each letter formed with the careful precision of someone from a generation that had learned penmanship as a discipline. He wanted to open it immediately, to understand what his grandfather had been trying to tell him, but not here, not with Sam and Sullivan watching. "Is there anything else?" Sam asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Just the standard provisions about debts and taxes," Sullivan replied. "The estate is solvent, though the farm does carry a mortgage with First Kansas Bank. Approximately $140,000 remaining on the principal." Sam's jaw tightened at that number, but he nodded as if he'd already known. Nate filed the information away, adding it to the growing list of things his brother hadn't shared. Secrets kept in the same locked room as whatever their grandfather had been hiding. The meeting concluded with paperwork and signatures, the mechanical processing of desk bureaucracy, and then Nate and Sam were standing on the sidewalk outside Sullivan's office, blinking in the harsh midday sun. A few pickup trucks rolled past. An elderly woman walked her dog. Life in a small Kansas town continued its slow rotation, indifferent to the fact that Nate's entire understanding of his family had just been overturned. "I don't understand," Nate said finally, breaking the silence between them. "Why the tiller? Why something that's been broken for 40 years? Sam shrugged, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Grandpa had his reasons. He always did." "Did he talk to you about this? About why he was leaving everything to you?" "He talked about keeping the farm together," Sam replied carefully. "About not letting it get divided up and sold off piece by piece. That's what happens when you split property. It falls apart." The explanation made sense on the surface, but it didn't account for the tiller, that specific bequest that felt like a puzzle Nate was supposed to solve. He opened his mouth to press further, but Sam had already turned away, walking toward his truck with the conversation clearly over. Nate drove back to the farm alone, the sealed envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a passenger he was afraid to acknowledge. The afternoon sun turned the wheat fields into an ocean of gold and brown, beautiful in the way that dying things sometimes are, when the light hits them just right. He thought about his grandfather sitting on the porch in those final weeks, staring out at this same view, and wondered what the old man had been thinking about. Had he known that Nate would feel betrayed? Had he counted on it? The farmhouse was empty when Nate arrived. Sam had gone somewhere, probably to check on the irrigation system or tend to one of the 1,000 tasks that farming demanded. Nate went to his room and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing himself to open the envelope his grandfather had left behind. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same careful handwriting as the envelope, dated 3 months ago, right around the time of Nate's last visit. "Nathan," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're angry. Good. Anger means you still care about something, and I need you to care about this. The farm goes to Samuel because he stayed, because he understands what it means to put your hands in the dirt every day. But the tiller goes to you because you're the one who left, the one who learned to see beyond these fences. What looks broken isn't always broken. Sometimes it's just waiting for someone smart enough to fix it. The tiller represents roots, Nathan. Your roots. Your father's roots. Roots that go deeper than you know. When you were 12, you asked me why we kept that old machine if it didn't work anymore, and I told you some things are worth keeping even when they're broken. I need you to remember that now. I need you to understand that what appears to be junk might be the most valuable thing I own. Find the tiller. Really look at it. Not with the eyes of a government analyst, but with the eyes of that boy who used to help me in the workshop, who understood that every tool has a purpose, even if that purpose isn't obvious. What's broken can be fixed if you know where to dig. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. I'm sorry for a lot of things. But most of all, I'm sorry I'm leaving you and your brother to figure this out. You'll need each other more than you know. Trust him, even when it's hard. And remember that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't land. It's knowing what's worth fighting for. With love and faith in you both, your grandfather, Colonel James Garrett." Nate read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meaning in every word, every phrase. The tiller. His grandfather kept coming back to that rusted piece of equipment, insisting it held some kind of significance that Nate was supposed to understand. But what could a broken farm implement from 1953 possibly contain that was worth more than 280 acres of prime Kansas farmland? He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, then sat there for a long moment, staring at the wall where his FFA ribbons hung. The first place trophy for livestock judging, second place in agricultural mechanics, the remnants of a childhood spent learning skills he'd eventually abandoned in favor of policy papers and congressional briefings. His grandfather had called him smart, but right now Nate felt anything but intelligent. He felt like he was missing something obvious, like the answer was right in front of him, but he lacked the eyes to see it. The rest of that day passed in a haze of uncertainty. Sam returned around dinner time but didn't offer any explanation of where he'd been, and Nate didn't ask. They ate in near silence, the television playing news neither of them paid attention to, and afterwards Sam retreated to his room while Nate sat on the porch watching darkness consume the familiar landscape. Sleep was impossible that night. Nate's mind kept circling back to his grandfather's words, to the insistence that the tiller held answers he needed to find. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up on rest and went downstairs, moving quietly so as not to wake Sam. He pulled on boots and a jacket, grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and walked out into the Kansas night toward the equipment shed. The building sat about 50 yards from the main house, a metal structure that had replaced an older wooden barn sometime in the 1970s. Inside, it smelled of motor oil and rust and the particular kind of dust that only accumulated in places where time moves slowly. Nate clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the organized chaos of farming equipment. The shed was arranged with military precision, a habit his grandfather had never lost from his years in the Army. Tools hung on pegboards in order of size and function. Spare parts were sorted into labeled bins. The larger equipment, tractors and harvesters and plows, occupied specific spaces marked out with painted lines on the concrete floor. And there, in the back corner, near a stack of rotting hay bales, sat the 1953 John Deere tiller. It looked even worse in the flashlight's harsh beam than Nate remembered. Rust had consumed most of the exposed metal, turning it from green to a mottled brown and orange that crumbled at the touch. The tires had rotted away decades ago, leaving just the wheel rims sitting on blocks. The engine compartment was open, revealing a mass of seized pistons and corroded wiring that would take weeks to restore, if restoration was even possible. Nate circled the machine slowly, trying to see what his grandfather had wanted him to see. It was just a tiller. Old, broken, worthless, except maybe as scrap metal. The kind of thing that should have been hauled away years ago, but had lingered because farmers never threw anything away, operating under the philosophy that everything might be useful someday. He spent an hour examining every inch of the machine, looking for hidden compartments or messages, finding nothing but rust and decay and the sad evidence of decades spent forgotten in a corner. Finally, frustrated and exhausted, he returned to the house and climbed back into bed, lying awake until dawn broke across the Kansas sky with no more answers than he'd had when he started. The next day passed in similar fashion. Sam worked the farm while Nate wandered the property, ostensibly helping but mostly lost in thought about puzzles he couldn't solve. Vernon Mitchell stopped by in the late afternoon, ostensibly to check on the brothers, but really, Nate suspected, to see how they were handling their grandfather's death. "You look troubled, son," Vernon observed as they stood together near the barn. "Just trying to understand something Grandpa left me," Nate admitted. "A message that doesn't make sense." Vernon's weathered face creased with something that might have been knowing sympathy. James was good at leaving messages that took time to understand. Patient man, figured the important things would reveal themselves when folks were ready to see them. "What if I'm not ready?" Nate asked. "What if I never figure out what he wanted me to know?" "Then you'll keep looking until you do," Vernon replied simply. "That's how these things work. Your grandfather had faith you'd solve whatever puzzle he left you. I'd trust that faith if I were you." That evening, after Vernon had departed and Sam had gone to check the irrigation one more time before nightfall, Nate returned to the equipment shed. This time he brought proper lighting, a work lamp that he plugged into the wall outlet, flooding the space with harsh white illumination that banished every shadow. He approached the tiller with renewed determination, running his hands along every surface, looking for anything that might indicate purpose or meaning. The frame was solid despite the rust. The wheels, though rotted, were standard equipment. The engine was seized but otherwise unremarkable for a machine of its vintage. But as he moved to examine the back of the tiller, his hand brushed against the oil reservoir tank, and he noticed something strange. A patch of metal on the tank side looked different from the rest, less corroded, almost as if someone had cleaned it recently. Nate knelt down to examine it more closely and realized it wasn't just clean. There was something etched into the metal, marks that had been hidden under decades of grease and dirt, but were now partially visible. His heart began to race as he grabbed a rag from a nearby workbench and began carefully wiping away the accumulated grime. The marks became clearer with each pass of the cloth. Not random scratches, but deliberate engravings, precise lines that formed patterns and shapes. Numbers, Nate realized with a jolt of recognition. Someone had laser-etched coordinates into the oil reservoir of a 1953 farm tiller. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and carefully transcribed the numbers, double-checking each digit to ensure accuracy. Then he opened his mapping application and entered the coordinates, watching as the screen loaded and displayed a location. The coordinates pointed to a spot on the Garrett property itself, in the southwest corner, near an old grain silo that hadn't been used since the 1970s, when his grandfather had switched from corn to wheat. Nate stared at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. His grandfather had hidden something, not in the house or the barn, but somewhere on the property, in a location that could only be found if you knew to look for coordinates etched into a piece of supposedly broken equipment that only one person would inherit. He checked the time. Nearly 9 o'clock, too late and too dark to go exploring tonight. But tomorrow, first thing, he would follow those coordinates and see what his grandfather had been hiding for God knew how long. The puzzle was starting to take shape, though Nate still couldn't see the full picture. Sleep came easier that night, exhaustion finally overwhelming anxiety, and when Nate woke the next morning, Sam had already left to work the fields. Nate made coffee, forced himself to eat breakfast despite having no appetite, and then set out across the property toward the southwest corner, his phone's GPS guiding him toward the coordinates he'd found etched in the tiller's oil reservoir. The old grain silo came into view that as he walked, a concrete cylinder 30 feet tall and 20 feet across, its metal roof rusted through in several places. It had been built in the 1950s, right around the time his grandfather had acquired the tiller, and Nate wondered if that timing was significant, if everything connected in ways he was only beginning to understand. The silo's wooden door hung crooked on its hinges, warped by decades of weather and neglect. Nate pulled it open with effort, the wood scraping against concrete, and peered inside. The interior was dark and smelled of rot and old grain, but as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could see that the floor wasn't level. There was a depression in the center, covered by what looked like a piece of plywood that didn't match the age of the structure. His heart was pounding now as he stepped inside and made his way to the plywood covering. It came up easily when he lifted it, revealing a metal hatch underneath, the kind you might find on a ship or a submarine. The hatch had a wheel lock mechanism that turned smoothly when Nate gripped it, suggesting someone had maintained it regularly despite the silo's appearance of abandonment. The hatch opened onto a ladder that descended into darkness. Nate pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, then began climbing down, counting the rungs as he went. 15 feet, 20, 25. The ladder ended in a small chamber, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a ceiling reinforced with steel beams. The air was cool and dry, climate-controlled somehow, and along one wall sat a series of metal storage cabinets and a workbench covered with equipment Nate didn't immediately recognize. But it was the wall opposite the cabinets that made him stop breathing, because there, mounted on hooks and shelves, were hundreds of glass jars, each one labeled with dates and numbers and filled with seeds. And beside the jars, in frames protected by glass, were photographs that showed a much younger James Garrett, dressed not in farming clothes, but in a military uniform, standing alongside other men in what appeared to be a laboratory setting. Nate moved closer to examine the photographs. One showed his grandfather shaking hands with a general, both of them smiling for the camera. Another depicted what looked like a research facility, with rows of plants growing under artificial lights. A third photograph, larger than the others, showed a group of about 20 men and women standing in front of a building with a sign that read, United States Army Agricultural Corps, Fort Riley, Kansas, 1952. The seed jars were labeled with a designation that repeated across dozens of samples, K7, and beneath that designation, generation numbers that range from generation 1 in the oldest jars to generation 47 in the newest, dated just 2 months ago. Whatever his grandfather had been doing down here, he'd been doing it for more than 60 years, carefully preserving and cultivating something that required this level of secrecy and protection. On the workbench, Nate found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his grandfather's handwriting, dense paragraphs of technical observations mixed with sketches of plant structures and tables of data. He flipped to the first page and began reading. January 15th, 1953. Project K7 continues despite official termination. Have secured final samples and established private cultivation site beneath grain silo. Initial germination rate 92%. Must maintain absolute secrecy. The government abandoned this work too soon, unable to see beyond immediate military applications to the larger implications for agricultural security. What we created was meant to save lives in the event of nuclear war, but it could save millions more if properly developed for civilian use. I will not let this knowledge die because short-sighted bureaucrats decided it was no longer strategically valuable. Nate turned pages, scanning through years of observations and refinements, watching his grandfather's project evolve from military research to personal obsession. The entries spoke of drought resistance and germination rates, of soil composition and genetic stability. Whatever K7 was, it represented decades of work, hidden away from the world, continued in secret long after the official project had been shut down. And then, near the end of the journal, Nate found an envelope tucked between the pages, sealed with wax and marked with his name. His hands were shaking as he opened it, revealing another letter in his grandfather's handwriting. This one dated just 3 weeks ago. Nathan, if you found this place, you're smarter than I gave you credit for, and I gave you plenty of credit. What you're looking at is 60 years of work, the most important thing I've ever done, and the reason your brother thinks I'm leaving everything to him. Sam knows about K7, has known for years, but he doesn't understand its value. To him, it's just seeds. To the people who want it, it's worth billions of dollars and control over global food supplies. I'm writing this because I don't trust the will Sullivan has on file. Samuel has been compromised, though not entirely by his own choice. 3 months ago, a man named David Crenshaw approached him with an offer: money to pay off the farm's debts in exchange for information about my research. Your brother refused at first, but Crenshaw has ways of applying pressure. Ways I won't detail here because I need you to forgive Samuel for what he's about to do. He thinks he's protecting the farm, protecting our family name. He doesn't realize he's been played by people who see farmers as obstacles to profit. The real will is here in this room in a fireproof safe built into the north wall behind the cabinet marked Storage B. The combination is your birth date, 07/06/1994. That will divide everything equally between you and your brother and specifies that K7 must be transferred to Kansas State University's agricultural program, not sold or commercialized. I want this research to help people, Nathan, not to make corporations richer. Your father discovered something about K7 18 years ago, something that made him a threat to certain powerful interests. His accident wasn't an accident. I have proof, documentation that I've kept hidden because I was afraid of losing everything, afraid of what they might do to you and Samuel if I fought back. I chose silence over justice, and I've carried that shame every day since. Don't make my mistakes. Fight for what's right, even when it costs you everything. The letter ended there, but Nate's mind was reeling with implications. His father murdered, his brother being manipulated. A corporate conspiracy to steal research that could change global agriculture. And at the center of it all, this hidden chamber filled with seeds that represented something valuable enough to kill for. He found the safe exactly where his grandfather had indicated, hidden behind a metal cabinet that slid aside on well-oiled tracks. The combination lock clicked open when he entered his birth date, revealing a space about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Inside were more journals, technical documents, and a sealed legal envelope marked Last Will and Testament of Colonel James Garrett, executed just 3 weeks ago. Nate pulled out the will and opened it carefully. The document was brief, just 2 pages, but it was properly witnessed and notarized, bearing the signature of a lawyer in Topeka rather than Robert Sullivan. It stated clearly that the estate was to be divided equally between Nathan and Samuel Garrett, with all real property, assets, and equipment split 50-50. And it specified in explicit terms that the biological materials designated as Project K7, including all seeds, research notes, and documentation, were to be transferred to Kansas State University's Department of Agricultural Sciences, with the provision that the research be made available to the public domain and never patented or commercialized for private profit. A sound from above made Nate freeze. Footsteps on the silo floor, the creak of the plywood being moved. He shoved the will back into the safe and closed it quickly, then moved to the base of the ladder just as a beam of light appeared from above. "Nate, you down there?" It was Sam's voice, tight with something that might have been concern or fear or both. "Yeah," Nate called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "Found something interesting?" His brother's face appeared in the opening above, illuminated from behind so Nate couldn't read his expression. "You need to come up. Now." The tone left no room for argument. Nate climbed the ladder, emerging into the silo where the morning light filtered through the holes in the roof. Sam was standing near the door, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking at something beyond Nate's shoulder. "How long have you known about this?" Nate asked, gesturing back toward the hatch. "About a year," Sam admitted. "Grandpa showed me right after the bank started making noise about foreclosure. Thought I should know what was really valuable on this property." "And you didn't think to mention it to me?" "You left, Nate. You made it clear you didn't want anything to do with this place." The accusation hung between them, and Nate felt the familiar surge of defensiveness that came whenever his brother brought up his departure. But before he could respond, headlights swept across the silo entrance, and both men turned to see a black SUV pulling up the dirt road toward them, its expensive paint job and city plates completely out of place in the rural landscape. The vehicle stopped about 20 feet away, and a man climbed out, dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt that probably cost more than Sam's entire wardrobe. He was in his mid-40s with the kind of polished confidence that came from boardrooms and country clubs, completely at odds with the dying wheat fields that surrounded them. "Mr. Garrett!" the man called out, his voice friendly, but with an edge underneath like a knife wrapped in silk. "Both of them, what excellent timing." Sam's posture had gone rigid, and Nate noticed his brother's hands had formed into fists. "What are you doing here, Crenshaw?" The name clicked into place. David Crenshaw, the man from his grandfather's letter, the corporate representative who'd approached Sam about K7. Crenshaw smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about the Colonel's passing. Wanted to pay my respects and see if you'd reconsidered my offer. These are difficult times for family farms, and I'd hate to see the Garrett legacy end because of stubborn pride." "We're not interested," Nate said, stepping forward to stand beside his brother. Crenshaw's attention shifted to him, assessing him the way a predator might size up new prey. "You must be Nathan, the policy analyst. I've read some of your work. Very thoughtful pieces about agricultural sustainability. Your grandfather spoke highly of you." "You never met my grandfather." "Didn't I?" Crenshaw's smile widened. "Think you'd be surprised about what I know, Nathan. About your family, about your father's tragic accident, about the research hidden beneath that silo you just climbed out of." The casual mention of Daniel Garrett's death sent a chill down Nate's spine, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Crenshaw replied smoothly, "which is why I'm here, to help you understand what you've inherited. K7 isn't just seeds, gentlemen. It's the key to agricultural independence in an era of climate chaos. It's worth conservatively $2 billion in market value, and that's before you factor in the strategic applications. "It's not for sale," Sam said flatly. Crenshaw turned his attention back to Sam, and something in his expression shifted from friendly to threatening. "Samuel, we had an agreement. I upheld my end. The bank received an anonymous payment covering your missed mortgage installments. You don't think that was charity, do you?" Nate looked at his brother sharply. "What is he talking about?" Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer, and Crenshaw filled the silence with obvious satisfaction. "Your brother made a deal 6 months ago. Information about the Colonel's research in exchange for financial assistance. He's been feeding me details about K7 for quite some time now." The betrayal hit Nate like a physical blow, but before he could process it, Sam was moving, closing the distance between himself and Crenshaw with dangerous speed. "I told you what I knew because you said you'd leave the farm alone. You promised no one would get hurt." "And no one has," Crenshaw replied, taking a step back but not looking particularly concerned. Yet. But promises only hold value as long as both parties honor them. You stopped cooperating 2 weeks ago, Samuel. That changes the terms of our arrangement. Get off our property, Nate said, his voice colder than he'd ever heard it. Now, or I'm calling the sheriff. Crenshaw laughed, a sound without humor. By all means, call Sheriff Bradley. He's been very understanding about certain irregularities in his campaign finances. I'm sure he'd be happy to help. He pulled out a business card and held it toward Nate. Take this. When you're ready to have a serious conversation about your future, about protecting what your grandfather built, give me a call. You have 48 hours before my offer expires and things become considerably more complicated for your family. He got back in his SUV and drove away, leaving Nate and Sam standing in the gathering darkness. Two brothers who'd barely spoken in 12 years, now bound together by a secret that could destroy them or save them, depending on choices neither of them knew how to make. Tell me everything, Nate said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. From the beginning. And as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had guided generations of Garretts across these fields, Sam began to talk, the words coming slowly at first and then faster, like water breaking through a dam. He told Nate about the drought years, about watching the farm they'd inherited lose money season after season while the bank's letters became increasingly threatening. He told him about the night Crenshaw had first approached him, offering money and understanding and a way to save everything their family had built. And he told him about the moment he'd realized he'd made a terrible mistake. About 3 weeks ago, when their grandfather had called him into the house and explained what K7 really was, why it mattered, and what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. He said you'd come back, Sam finished, his voice rough with emotion. He said you were the only one smart enough to figure out what to do. I didn't believe him. Thought he was just being sentimental about his college-educated grandson. But he was right. You found the room. You found the real will. You're 3 steps ahead already. Nate didn't feel 3 steps ahead. He felt lost and overwhelmed and completely unprepared for the weight of what his grandfather had left behind. But as he looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time in years, he saw something he'd missed before. Not betrayal or weakness, but fear. Sam was afraid, had been afraid for months, and he'd made bad decisions because he'd been trying to protect the only thing he knew how to protect. We'll figure this out, Nate said, and he realized he meant it. Together, the way Grandpa wanted. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles. While below them, 2 brothers stood on land their ancestors had worked for more than a century, holding secrets that could change the world or destroy them in trying. The kitchen of the Garrett farmhouse had witnessed a century of difficult conversations, but none quite like the one that unfolded in the hours after midnight, when sleep proved impossible and the weight of secrets demanded words. Nate sat across from Sam at the same oak table where their grandmother had kneaded bread every Sunday morning, where their father had done homework as a boy, where Colonel James Garrett had probably sat planning the deception that would protect his research for 6 decades after the government abandoned it. Sam had made coffee, strong and black the way their grandfather preferred it, and now the 2 brothers nursed their mugs while the overhead light cast harsh shadows across faces that shared the same bone structure, the same stubborn jaw, the same eyes that had looked out at these Kansas fields through 4 generations of Garrett men. I need to know everything, Nate said again, his voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at him. Not just about Crenshaw, about Dad, about what Grandpa told you. Sam's hands tightened around his mug, the calluses on his palms catching the light. He'd been quiet since they'd come inside, processing what it meant that Nate had found the underground chamber, that the secret Sam had been keeping was now shared knowledge, that the burden he'd carried alone for a year had suddenly become a weight they would either lift together or be crushed beneath separately. Dad died when you were 12, Sam began, his voice rough from too many cigarettes and too much dust. I was 17, old enough to understand that something about the accident didn't add up, young enough that nobody thought to include me in the conversations Grandpa had with the sheriff. Nate remembered the funeral, the way the casket had been closed because the machinery had done damage that couldn't be repaired with mortician's art. He remembered his mother's blank expression, the way she'd moved through the service like someone underwater, and the way she'd left Kansas 6 months later, unable to look at the farm that had taken her husband. She lived in Arizona now, with a new husband and a life that didn't include frequent calls to the sons she'd left behind. What kind of things didn't add up? Nate asked, though part of him didn't want to know, wanted to preserve the official story of accident and misfortune rather than face the darker truth his grandfather's letter had implied. Sam stood and walked to a drawer near the sink, pulling out a manila folder that looked old and worn from handling. He placed it on the table between them and sat back down, not opening it immediately, as if the contents required preparation. Grandpa kept this in his bedroom safe, Sam explained. Gave it to me last year when I told him about Crenshaw's first approach. Said I needed to understand what we were really dealing with. Inside the folder were police reports, photographs, and what appeared to be a private investigator's case file dated 2007, a year after their father's death. Nate spread the documents across the table, his hands moving with the careful precision he'd learned from reviewing policy papers in Washington, treating each piece of evidence like fragments of a story that had been deliberately obscured. The official police report was brief and concluded with the kind of bureaucratic certainty that Nate recognized from his government work. Operator error, failure to engage safety mechanisms, tragic but not suspicious. But the photographs told a different story if you knew what to look for. The combine harvester's safety lock had been bypassed, but not from the outside as one might expect in a rushed attempt to save time. Someone had opened the mechanism from the inside, deliberately disabling the very feature that would have prevented the blades from engaging while someone was near them. Dad was too experienced to make that kind of mistake, Sam said quietly. He'd been running machinery since he was 8 years old. Safety wasn't something he thought about. It was instinct, like breathing. The private investigator's report was more detailed and considerably more damning. A man named Robert Chase had been hired by Colonel Garrett in 2007 to examine the accident with fresh eyes. And what Chase had found was a pattern of tampering that the local police had either missed or chosen to ignore. The hydraulic lines had been partially cut in a way that would cause catastrophic failure after several hours of operation. The safety mechanism had been disabled using tools that Daniel Garrett didn't own and wouldn't have needed for any legitimate purpose. And most telling, there were traces of accelerant on the operator's seat, suggesting someone had tried to start a fire that had failed to catch. The investigator concluded it was murder made to look like an accident, Nate said, the words feeling unreal even as he spoke them. Who did this? Who would want Dad dead? Sam pulled out another document, this one a letter dated 3 weeks before Daniel Garrett's death, addressed to someone named Marcus Webb. The handwriting was their father's, the words urgent and worried. Marcus, I think I've made a mistake. I mentioned the K7 research to a consultant from AgriCorp, who approached me about improving our fertilizer application. He seemed genuinely interested in sustainable farming, asked a lot of questions about Dad's techniques and why our yields were consistently higher than neighboring farms during drought years. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but he's been back 3 times now, each time pressing harder for details. Yesterday, he offered me $50,000 for information about any proprietary methods we use. When I refused and asked him to leave, he said something that's been bothering me. He said, "Your father can't protect his secrets forever, and neither can you." How did he know about Dad's research? I never mentioned it specifically. I need your advice on how to handle this. The letter ended there, unsigned, as if their father had been interrupted while writing it, and Nate felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. AgriCorp, the same company that had sent David Crenshaw to approach Sam 30 years later. The same corporate interest that had been circling the Garrett farm like vultures for at least 2 decades, waiting for opportunities to extract what they couldn't buy legitimately. Did Grandpa ever send this letter? Nate asked. Don't know, Sam replied. But 2 weeks after Dad wrote it, the equipment shed burned down. Lost about $40,000 worth of machinery. Fire marshal called it electrical, but Grandpa always said it was a warning. Then Dad died and Grandpa went silent. Locked himself away with his research and didn't talk about it for years. Nate stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the barn and equipment shed against the star-filled sky. Out there, buried beneath an abandoned grain silo, were seeds that represented a lifetime of work and apparently enough value to justify murder. His father had died because he'd asked the wrong questions to the wrong person. His grandfather had lived with that knowledge, choosing silence and survival over justice and revenge. And now Sam had been pulled into the same web, compromised by his own desperation to save the family farm. "We need to talk to this Marcus Webb," Nate said, turning back to face his brother. "If he knew about Case 7 back then, he might know more about AgriCorp's involvement. He might be able to help us." Sam nodded slowly. Grandpa mentioned him sometimes. Said they'd served together in Korea and worked on some kind of agricultural project afterward. "I tried to find him after Grandpa died, but the number I had was disconnected." "I can find him," Nate assured him, his government contacts suddenly feeling useful for the first time since he'd taken the job in Washington. "But first, we need to secure the research. If Crenshaw knows about the underground chamber, he might try to access it before we can move everything." They spent the rest of the night planning. Two brothers who'd barely spoken in 12 years now working together with the kind of instinctive coordination that came from shared blood and shared crisis. Sam knew the farm's vulnerability points, the ways someone could access the property without being seen. Nate understood documentation and legal procedures, the mechanisms that might protect their grandfather's research long enough to transfer it safely to Kansas State University. By dawn, they had a strategy. Sam would visit the county recorder's office and file the real will, forcing a legal challenge that would at least create a paper trail and public record. Nate would contact Dr. Helen Parker at the university and arrange for the Case 7 samples to be moved to a secure facility under academic protection. And together they would track down Marcus Webb and hope that whatever knowledge he possessed about their grandfather's past might illuminate a path forward through the present danger. The county seat was 30 miles east in Junction City, a larger town that had grown up around Fort Riley and served as the administrative center for Geary County. The recorder's office occupied the second floor of a limestone courthouse built in 1912, and Sam arrived when the doors opened at 8 o'clock, the real will sealed in an envelope that suddenly felt like it weighed more than all the wheat his family had grown over 6 generations. The clerk who accepted the filing was a woman in her 50s named Dorothy Preston, who'd gone to high school with Sam and remembered him as the quiet boy who'd been good at mechanics. She processed the paperwork with professional efficiency, time stamping the envelope and entering it into the county's digital record system, creating an official record that would be almost impossible to erase or ignore. "This is going to cause some complications," Dorothy observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Sullivan already filed a will for Colonel Garrett 2 weeks ago. Now there's a competing document with a more recent date. The probate court will have to sort it out." "That's what I'm counting on," Sam replied. Back at the farm, Nate was making phone calls from his grandfather's study, a room that still smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper despite James Garrett having quit smoking 20 years ago. Dr. Helen Parker answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been awake for hours already, probably tending to plants in the university's greenhouses before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. "Nathan Garrett," she said, and Nate could hear the smile in her voice. "I was hoping you'd call. I wanted to express my condolences again. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I've known." "Thank you, Dr. Parker. Actually, I'm calling because I need your help with something Grandpa left behind, something you might find professionally interesting." He explained about Case 7 in broad strokes, leaving out the details about murder and corporate conspiracy, but emphasizing the research's potential significance and the need to move it quickly to a secure location. Parker's responses shifted from polite interest to intense focus as Nate described the seed generations, the climate-controlled storage, the decades of careful documentation. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that Colonel Garrett has been conducting agricultural research in secret for 60 years? Research that might have applications for drought resistance?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, and I need to get it into academic hands before certain commercial interests try to claim it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Nate could almost hear her mind working through the implications, the questions a scientist would naturally ask when presented with data that seemed too good to be true. "I can have a team there this afternoon," Parker said finally. "We'll need proper storage containers, climate control during transport, full documentation of chain of custody. If this research is as significant as you're suggesting, we can't afford any questions about its integrity." They arranged the details, and Nate felt a small measure of relief knowing that at least the seeds themselves would soon be beyond AgriCorp's reach. But seeds were only part of the equation. The real value lay in the knowledge of how to cultivate them, the decades of refinement that had turned a military experiment into something that could potentially feed millions. And that knowledge existed in his grandfather's journals, in the detailed notes that documented every generation of development, every adaptation and improvement. Finding Marcus Webb proved easier than Nate had expected. A search through Department of Agriculture personnel records, accessed through his government credentials, revealed that Marcus Webb had retired from the Army in 1987 with the rank of colonel and had subsequently worked as a consultant for various agricultural research firms. He was 72 years old now, living in a small town in Virginia, and when Nate called the number listed in the database, Webb answered on the second ring. "This is Colonel Webb," the voice said, crisp and alert despite the early hour on the East Coast. "Colonel Webb, my name is Nathan Garrett. I'm James Garrett's grandson." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Nate thought the connection might have been lost. Then Webb spoke again, his voice softer, tinged with something that might have been grief or regret, or both. "How is James? I haven't heard from him in nearly 2 years. He passed away 4 days ago, sir. Heart attack." Another silence, this one filled with the kind of weight that comes from losing people who've shared experiences no one else could understand. When Webb spoke again, his voice was rough. "He was a good man, one of the best I served with. I'm sorry for your loss, son." "Thank you, sir. I'm calling because I've discovered some research he left behind. Project K7. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand it." The change on the other end of the line was immediate and palpable. Webb's breathing shifted, became more controlled, and when he spoke, his words carried the careful precision of someone choosing them with extreme caution. "Where are you calling from, Nathan?" "The family farm in Kansas." "Is this line secure?" The question sent a chill down Nate's spine. "I'm calling from my grandfather's landline." "Then we shouldn't discuss this further over the phone. Can you get to Kansas City Airport? There's a direct flight to Richmond that leaves at 2:30. I'll meet you there tomorrow morning." "Is it really that serious?" Nate asked, though he already knew the answer. "Your grandfather and I worked on something that could have changed the world, Nathan. Then powerful people decided that change wasn't in their interest. If you've inherited James's research, you've also inherited the attention of those people. And they don't forget, they don't forgive, and they sure as hell don't give up." Webb provided an address where they should meet, then hung up without further explanation, leaving Nate holding a dead phone and feeling like he'd just stepped into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple inheritance dispute. Dr. Parker's team arrived at the farm just after 1 o'clock. 3 people in a university van, equipped with portable climate control units and enough documentation forms to satisfy the most paranoid bureaucrat. Parker herself was shorter than Nate had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with iron gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing as she surveyed the grain silo and the surrounding property. "This is quite isolated," she observed, and Nate couldn't tell if she was impressed or concerned. Sam led them to the silo and down into the underground chamber, and Nate watched Parker's face as she took in the rows of seed jars, the careful labeling, the environmental controls that had kept everything preserved for decades. Her expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching awe. "My God," she whispered, moving closer to examine the samples. "This is extraordinary. The documentation alone represents a lifetime of work." Her team began the careful process of cataloging and packing the seeds, while Parker examined the journals, her fingers tracing the entries with reverence. She paused at one particular passage, her eyebrows rising. "Nathan, did you read this entry from 1967? Nate moved to look over her shoulder at the page she'd indicated. His grandfather's handwriting filled the margins with notes about germination rates and soil composition, but it was the main entry that had caught Parker's attention. "Today marks generation 15 of K7 development. Yield improvement over baseline now exceeds 40% under drought conditions. More significantly, the plants demonstrate adaptive resilience I've never observed in traditional cultivars. They're not just surviving stress, they're learning from it, developing resistance mechanisms that persist across generations. If I'm right about the genetic markers, we've stumbled onto something that could revolutionize agriculture in arid regions. But I can't publish this. Can't even hint at it in public forums. Too many people would want to control it, to patent it, to turn what should help everyone into profit for a few. So I continue in silence, watching my secret garden grow." "He was describing epigenetic adaptation," Parker said, her voice filled with academic excitement. "Stress-induced genetic changes that persist across generations without formal genetic modification. This is Nobel Prize-level research, Nathan, and he never published a word of it. Because he knew what would happen if he did, Nate replied, thinking about his father's letter, about warnings ignored and consequences paid in blood. The transfer of materials took 3 hours, with each jar carefully wrapped and logged, each journal photographed and documented, creating a chain of custody that would protect the research's integrity in whatever legal battles were to come. Parker promised to store everything in the university's most secure facility and to begin preliminary analysis of the seeds within 48 hours. As her team was loading the last containers into the van, Vernon Mitchell's pickup truck appeared on the dirt road, moving faster than the old farmer usually drove. He pulled up beside the university vehicle and climbed out with visible effort, his face pale beneath his permanent tan. "Sam, Nate," he called out, his voice urgent. "We need to talk, now." They gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, Vernon accepting a glass of water with shaking hands. He looked like he'd aged a decade since the funeral, the lines in his face deeper, his movements more fragile. "My equipment shed burned last night," he said without preamble. "Lost everything. Both tractors, the combine, 30 years of tools. Fire department says it was arson, accelerant used, multiple points of origin." The news hit like a physical blow. Sam's face went white, and Nate felt rage building in his chest, cold and focused. Vernon Mitchell had been their grandfather's closest friend, a man who'd helped them harvest crops and repair machinery and survive the lean years when survival seemed impossible. And now he'd been targeted because he'd stood with them at the funeral, because he'd been visibly loyal to the Garrett family. "They did this because of us," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you were Grandpa's friend." Vernon shook his head firmly. "They did this because they're bullies who think money and fear can break people. But they picked the wrong generation to intimidate. I've survived drought, depression, and stupider men than David Crenshaw. This isn't going to break me." But Nate could see the lie in the old man's eyes, could see the fear beneath the bravado. Vernon's insurance probably wouldn't cover half the loss. At 77, he didn't have the years left to rebuild. The fire had been a message, and the message was clear. Oppose AgriCorp and pay the price. "How much to replace everything?" Nate asked quietly. Vernon waved the question away. "That's not why I came here. I came to tell you boys that whatever you're planning to do, you've got support. Folks in town are talking. Words spread about the will, about Crenshaw's visit, about the university people coming to collect research. People are paying attention now, and a lot of them remember what happened to your father." Sam looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Folks in farming communities talk, son. Always have. Some of us wondered about Daniel's accident even at the time. Too convenient, too clean. And when your equipment shed burned 2 weeks before he died, well, some of us put pieces together that maybe the sheriff didn't want to see." Nate felt his chest tighten. "You think people knew Dad was murdered?" "I think some people suspected," Vernon corrected. "But suspicion without proof is just gossip, and small towns learn to keep their mouths shut when they're not sure who's listening. Your grandfather understood that. He chose to protect his family rather than pursue justice. Can't say I blame him, given what he was protecting." Dr. Parker had been listening from the doorway, and now she stepped forward, her academic curiosity clearly warring with concern for the human drama unfolding before her. "Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned people talking in town. Has anyone else been approached by AgriCorp representatives? Anyone else offered money for information or pressured to sell property?" Vernon nodded slowly. "At least 6 farms I know of have been contacted in the last year. Most refused initially, but 3 have since sold out. Good land too, prime acreage that's been in families for generations. AgriCorp bought it all through shell companies, paid about 30% over market value. They're consolidating," Nate said, the pattern becoming clear. "Buying up property around us, isolating the Garrett farm. When they finally move to acquire it, there won't be neighbors to object or witness what happens." The implications hung heavy in the kitchen air, mixing with the smell of coffee and the dust that perpetually filtered through the windows of Kansas farmhouses. AgriCorp wasn't just interested in K7, they were executing a long-term strategy to control agricultural land in the region, positioning themselves to dominate local food production. The research was valuable, but so was the land itself, especially if climate change made drought-resistant crops the difference between profit and failure. That evening, after Dr. Parker's team had departed with their precious cargo of seeds and journals, after Vernon had gone home to survey the ashes of his life's work, Nate and Sam sat on the porch watching the sun set over fields that might not be theirs much longer. The air had cooled slightly, bringing with it the smell of distant rain that probably wouldn't reach them. Just another cruel promise in a summer of broken expectations. "I'm flying to Richmond tomorrow," Nate said, breaking the comfortable silence. Webb sounded like he knows things about K7 that weren't in the journals. Things about why the government shut down the project. "You think it'll help?" Sam asked, his voice tired. "I think we need to understand what we're really dealing with. Crenshaw isn't just some corporate acquisitions guy. He knows too much, moves too confidently. There's something bigger happening here." Sam nodded, accepting this the way he accepted everything, with the fatalistic pragmatism of someone who'd learned that life rarely offered good options. Only choices between different kinds of hard. "What do you want me to do while you're gone?" he asked. "Talk to people. Find out who else AgriCorp has approached, who else might have information about Dad's death. And check the property line, especially the southwest corner near where the silo is. I want to know if anyone's been snooping around there recently." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching darkness spread across the land like a stain, consuming the details until only shapes remained. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, its voice lonely and wild, and Nate wondered if that was how his grandfather had felt all those years, keeping secrets in the darkness, waiting for someone to finally understand what he'd been protecting and why it mattered. Inside the house, in a drawer in his grandfather's study, Nate had found more documents that afternoon. Bank statements showing the mortgage was larger than Sullivan had indicated, nearly $180,000, with payments that had been missed twice in the last 6 months before mysterious deposits had brought the account current. Legal correspondence about water rights and property taxes, bureaucratic weapons that could be used to pressure a struggling farm into submission, and a photograph that Nate had stared at for a long time, trying to understand its significance. The photo showed his grandfather as a young man, maybe 30 years old, standing in what appeared to be a laboratory. He wore an army uniform with insignia that Nate didn't recognize, and beside him stood 5 other men and 2 women, all wearing white lab coats over military dress. They were posed in front of a sign that read, "United States Army Agricultural Corps, Special Projects Division, Fort Riley, Kansas, 1952. And on the table in front of them sat several trays of wheat seedlings, each tray labeled with numbers that meant nothing to Nate, but probably represented the first generation of what would eventually become K7. On the back of the photograph, in his grandfather's handwriting, was a single sentence. "We thought we were preparing for the end of the world. We didn't realize we were creating its salvation." Nate had shown the photograph to Sam, who'd studied it with the same intensity Nate had, trying to read meaning into the expressions of people who'd been dead for decades, or who'd scattered to lives and careers that had nothing to do with the farm or the secrets it contained. "Grandpa never talked about his military service," Sam had said. "Not once. I asked him about Korea a few times when I was a kid, but he always changed the subject. Said the war was over and there was no point dwelling on what couldn't be changed." Now, sitting on the porch in the gathering dark, Nate wondered what his grandfather had seen in Korea. What experiences had shaped his decision to continue research that the government had abandoned? Webb would know. Webb had been there, had worked alongside James Garrett on something the old colonel had considered important enough to risk his life protecting. The sound of an engine pulled Nate from his thoughts. Headlights appeared on the road, moving toward the farm, and both brothers tensed, hands instinctively moving to positions that would allow them to stand quickly if needed. But it was just Harold Cooper, another neighboring farmer, pulling up in his battered Ford with a casserole dish visible on the passenger seat. "Thought you boys might need some food," Harold called out, climbing from his truck. "Wife made enough chicken and dumplings to feed an army." They accepted the offering gratefully, and Harold lingered for a few minutes, making the kind of small talk that farming communities specialized in, discussions of weather and crop prices, and whether the bank would extend credit for another planting season. But as he was leaving, he paused by his truck door and looked back at the brothers. "Your granddad was a good man," he said, his voice carrying across the darkening yard. "Smart too, smarter than most people knew. Whatever he left you boys, I figure it was worth protecting. You need help. There's about 40 of us around here who remember what community means. Don't forget that." After Harold had driven away, Sam turned to Nate with an expression that might have been hope or might have been the desperate optimism of someone trying to believe that good still existed in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. "Maybe we're not as alone as we thought," he said. Maybe, Nate agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. Something that had been building for decades and was finally ready to break like a storm over the flat Kansas landscape. That night, Nate packed a small bag for his trip to Virginia, laying out clothes and checking his laptop and phone, the rituals of travel providing a momentary distraction from the weight of everything he'd learned in the past 4 days. 4 days since his grandfather's death. 4 days since he'd returned to a place he'd spent 12 years trying to leave behind. And now here he was, preparing to fly across the country to meet a stranger who claimed to know secrets that might explain why his father had died and why his family farm had become the target of forces that operated beyond the boundaries of small-town law and local justice. Before bed, he went down to the basement one more time, standing in front of the heavy oak door that led to his grandfather's locked room. Sam had given him the key, a simple brass affair that looked like it belonged to a much older lock. And Nate had opened the door earlier that day, revealing a space that was part workshop, part archive, and part shrine to a lifetime of careful paranoia. The room contained filing cabinets full of newspaper clippings about agricultural policy and corporate mergers and environmental disasters. It held maps of the farm, marked with notations only his grandfather could have understood. And it held one more thing that Nate had found tucked inside a lockbox in the bottom drawer of the largest filing cabinet. A handgun, a Colt 1911 that looked military issue, cleaned and maintained with the same care his grandfather had given to everything he valued. Nate held the weapon now, feeling its weight, wondering if his grandfather had ever considered using it, if there had been moments when the old colonel had thought about taking direct action against the people who'd killed his son and threatened his family. But James Garrett had chosen a different path, had chosen to hide and wait and hope that someday the right person would inherit his secrets and know what to do with them. "I hope you were right about me, Grandpa," Nate whispered to the empty room, "because I'm not sure I know what I'm doing." The gun went into his luggage, wrapped in a towel and locked in a hard case that would pass through checked baggage. Nate told himself it was just insurance, that he probably wouldn't need it. But his father had probably thought the same thing the morning he'd walked out to check the combine harvester, never suspecting that the machinery he'd worked with his entire life had been turned into a weapon designed to silence him. Outside, the Kansas wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the smell of dust and drought and the dying remnants of a way of life that was slipping away like water through desperate fingers. And somewhere in the darkness, David Crenshaw was probably sitting in an air-conditioned hotel room, making phone calls to people who moved billions of dollars with signatures and saw human lives as nothing more than obstacles to quarterly earnings reports. The war for the Garrett farm had begun decades ago, with men in military uniforms making decisions about agricultural security and acceptable losses. It had continued through the years, with corporate strategists identifying targets and deploying resources and waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. And now, in the autumn of 2024, in the middle of the worst drought in half a century, that war was entering its final phase. Nate just hoped he and his brother would survive long enough to see how it ended. Richmond International Airport felt alien to Nate after just a week back in Kansas. All polished floors and rushing travelers who moved with the efficient anonymity of people who'd forgotten that destinations mattered less than the journeys between them. He'd caught the early morning flight, wheels up at 6:30, crossing the country while Sam stayed behind to work the farm and watch for whatever move AgriCorp would make next. The separation felt dangerous, like they were dividing their forces in the face of an enemy who'd proven willing to burn buildings and kill people to get what they wanted. Marcus Webb had specified a diner called Rosie's on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that catered to truckers and early risers and people who appreciated that good coffee didn't require Italian names or complicated ordering rituals. Nate arrived 20 minutes early, a habit from his government work, and took a booth near the back where he could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. The paranoia felt justified after everything he'd learned, though he wondered when exactly he'd crossed the line from policy analyst to someone who thought like a man at war. Webb arrived exactly on time, and Nate recognized him immediately despite having never seen a photograph. There was something in the way the old colonel carried himself, the straight-back posture that 72 years in a lifetime of civilian life hadn't managed to soften, the economical movements that suggested a man who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt that could have come from any farm supply store in Kansas, and his face had the weathered quality of someone who'd spent significant time outdoors even after leaving military service. He slid into the booth across from Nate without preamble, his blue eyes sharp and assessing, cataloging details the way a soldier might scout terrain before committing to a position. "You look like your grandfather," Webb said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice beneath the caution. Same stubborn jaw, same eyes that see more than they let on. "Thank you for meeting me, sir," Nate replied, and Webb waved away the formality with a gesture that suggested he'd left that world behind long ago. "Just Webb, or Marcus if you prefer. I stopped being colonel the day I took off the uniform." He ordered coffee from a waitress who looked like she'd been working this shift since the Carter administration, then turned his full attention back to Nate. "Now tell me everything. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." So Nate talked, laying out the story in chronological order, the way he'd been trained to brief senior officials in Washington. His grandfather's death, the will that left everything to Sam, the cryptic message about the 1953 tiller, the discovery of the underground chamber, and the K7 research. His father's murder, disguised as an accident. David Crenshaw's threats and Vernon Mitchell's barn burning. The transfer of seeds to Kansas State and the revelation that AgriCorp had been circling the Garrett farm for at least 20 years. Webb listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the narrative unfolded. And when Nate finished, the old soldier sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he'd stopped asking decades ago. "I wondered if this day would come," Webb said finally. "Hoped it wouldn't, but James always said the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep you bury it." He was right about that. Right about most things. He said in his letter that you worked together on K7, that it was a military project. Webb nodded slowly, then glanced around the diner as if checking for listeners, before leaning forward and lowering his voice to just above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you is still technically classified, though I expect the statute of limitations on my security clearance expired about the time they invented the internet. But old habits die hard, and some secrets feel heavier than others, even after all these years." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and Nate could see the weight of memory settling across the old man's features like dust on forgotten machinery. Operation Golden Harvest was authorized in 1951, right after we figured out the Soviets had the bomb and started thinking seriously about what a nuclear exchange would mean for American agriculture. The brass was worried about fallout contamination, about how to feed a population if significant portions of farmland became radioactive. So they assembled a team of agricultural scientists and gave us a simple mandate: develop crops that could survive and produce in contaminated soil. Nate felt a chill run down his spine. You were developing food for after a nuclear war. That was the initial goal, yes. Your grandfather and I were both stationed at Fort Riley. Both had backgrounds in agricultural science from before we enlisted. James had a degree from Kansas State, actually worked on his family farm through high school and college. The Army recruited him specifically for the program because he understood both the theory and the practical application. He could design experiments in the morning and plant them in the afternoon without needing a team of technicians to translate. Webb sipped his coffee, his eyes distant with recollection. "We started with wheat because it's a staple crop, foundation of the American diet, and because Kansas soil was readily available for testing. The first few generations failed spectacularly. Plants either died within weeks or grew so deformed they were useless. But James had this theory about adaptive stress response, about pushing plants to the edge of survival and seeing which genetic variations allowed them to persist. It was considered radical at the time, borderline insane by some of our colleagues, but it worked." K7, Nate said. "Generation 7 was when we first saw real promise. Plants that not only survived low-level radiation exposure, but actually seemed to thrive under conditions that killed conventional wheat. We were ecstatic. The project directors were talking about scaling up production, maybe even beginning to stockpile seeds in strategic locations around the country, and then everything changed." The waitress returned with a coffee pot, refilling their mugs, and both men fell silent until she'd moved away. Webb continued his story with the careful precision of someone who'd kept these details locked away for decades and was finally allowing them to see daylight. In 1953, someone in the program realized that the adaptive mechanisms we developed in K7 had applications beyond radiation resistance. The same genetic flexibility that allowed the wheat to survive contaminated soil also made it incredibly drought-resistant, pest-resistant, adaptable to almost any growing condition. We weren't just creating crops for nuclear winter. We were creating crops that could revolutionize agriculture in any challenging environment. That should have been good news, Nate observed. Webb's expression hardened. You'd think so. But about the same time we made this discovery, the political landscape was shifting. The fear of imminent nuclear war was fading as both sides settled into the long game of deterrence. The military's priorities moved to other threats, other programs. And more significantly, certain commercial agricultural interests became aware of what we'd developed and started asking uncomfortable questions about who owned the intellectual property. Nate leaned back into the booth, pieces clicking together. They wanted to patent it. More than that, they wanted to control it completely, turn it into a proprietary product that would give them unprecedented market dominance. See, if you've got seeds that outperform everything else by 40% and can grow in conditions where other crops fail, you don't just have a competitive advantage, you have a monopoly on food security. Countries would pay billions for access to that technology, and the company that controlled it would essentially control global agriculture. Let me guess, Nate said, anger building in his chest. AgriCorp. Webb nodded grimly. They weren't called that back then. It was American Agricultural Futures, a smaller operation but ambitious. Their CEO at the time was a man named Richard Morrison, and he had connections in the Defense Department, people who could influence which projects got funding and which got terminated. In 1955, Operation Golden Harvest was officially shut down. We were ordered to destroy all research materials, all seed samples, all documentation. The entire program was to be erased as if it had never existed. But Grandpa didn't destroy everything. James saved what he could, smuggled out seeds in his personal effects when he mustered out of the Army later that year, took his notes and hid them where no one would think to look. And for the next 6 decades, he continued the work in secret, refining K7 generation by generation, turning a military experiment into something that could genuinely help feed the world. Webb's voice carried a mixture of admiration and regret. He sacrificed everything for that research, Nathan. His career, his peace of mind, eventually even his son. Because the people who wanted K7 in 1955 never stopped wanting it. They just changed their tactics, waited for opportunities, and when James wouldn't sell, they started applying pressure in other ways. The diner had filled up with the lunch rush, farmers and construction workers, and retirees seeking the comfort of familiar food and friendly faces. The ordinariness of the scene felt surreal against the backdrop of conspiracy and murder that Webb was describing, as if two different realities were occupying the same space and pretending not to notice each other. You said you have proof about my father's death, Nate prompted, pulling Webb back from his memories. The old colonel reached into the canvas bag he'd brought with him and extracted a manila folder thick with documents. He slid it across the table, his hand lingering on it for a moment, as if reluctant to surrender what it contained. James sent me these about a month before your father died. Said he was worried that Daniel had been approached by someone claiming to represent agricultural consultants, but asking questions that seemed too specific, too focused on the family's unique farming methods. Your grandfather asked me to do some research, see if I could identify who was really behind the approach. Nate opened the folder and found himself looking at corporate records, personnel files, and a private investigator's report that made the documents his grandfather had kept look amateurish by comparison. Webb had apparently used his military contacts and post-retirement consulting work to dig deep into American agricultural futures and its evolution into the modern AgriCorp. That consultant who approached your father was named Stephen Marsh, Webb explained. On paper, he worked for an independent agricultural advisory firm out of Chicago. But that firm was actually a wholly owned subsidiary of American Agricultural Futures, created specifically for industrial espionage. Marsh's job was to identify farms that might have proprietary techniques or unusual yield patterns, gain their trust, and extract information that could be exploited. The investigator's report included surveillance photographs of Stephen Marsh, a pleasant-looking man in his 40s who could have been anyone's neighbor, and detailed accounts of his movements in the weeks before Daniel Garrett's death. He'd visited the farm 3 times. He'd been seen at the county recorder's office examining property records. And 2 days before the fatal accident, he'd met with a known saboteur, a man who specialized in making industrial accidents look like operator error. "This is murder for hire," Nate said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is documented proof of conspiracy to commit homicide." "It is," Webb agreed, "but it's also 20 years old, collected through methods that weren't entirely legal, involving people who've since died or disappeared. I gave all of this to James back in 2007 when he hired his own investigator after Daniel's death. He talked about going to the authorities, about finally exposing what had been done. But then he considered what that would mean for you and your brother, two boys who just lost their father and whose mother was falling apart. He decided the cost of justice was too high." Nate wanted to argue, wanted to say his grandfather should have fought regardless of the consequences, but he understood the impossible choice the old colonel had faced: pursue justice and risk losing everything, leaving his grandsons orphaned and homeless, or swallow the rage and grief, focus on protecting what remained of his family, and hope that someday the truth would matter more than it did in that dark moment. "There's more," Webb continued, and Nate wasn't sure he could handle more revelations, but knew he had no choice except to keep listening. "The reason AgriCorp wants K7 so desperately now, the reason they are escalating after all these years, is because of climate change. The drought you're experiencing in Kansas isn't an anomaly. It's the new normal. Global weather patterns are shifting in ways that make traditional agriculture increasingly difficult, and the regions affected are expanding every year." He pulled out another document, this one a climate projection report stamped with a Department of Agriculture seal. "I still have friends in the government," Webb explained, "people who owe me favors and understand that sometimes classified information serves the public good better when it's not classified. This report predicts that within 20 years, current wheat-growing regions will experience drought conditions that make conventional farming economically unfeasible without massive irrigation infrastructure that most family farms can't afford. But K7 could change that equation completely." Nate scanned the report, seeing projections that matched what he'd been observing in his policy work, but were far more dire than anything publicly available. Crop failures, water wars, food security crises that would make the current situation look manageable by comparison. "AgriCorp knows this," Webb said. "They've known it for years, and they've positioned themselves to dominate agriculture in the climate change world by controlling the technology that makes farming possible under the new conditions. K7 isn't just valuable, it's the key to controlling the global food supply for the next century." The weight of that realization settled over Nate like a physical burden. His grandfather hadn't just been protecting seeds or research or even family legacy. He'd been standing between corporate greed and the potential enslavement of global agriculture to a single profit-driven entity. "What do I do?" Nate asked, and he hated how helpless the question sounded. Webb leaned back, his expression thoughtful. James believed the answer was to make K7 public domain before AgriCorp could patent it, get it into the hands of university researchers, seed banks, farming cooperatives around the world, make it impossible to control by flooding the market with it. That's why he wanted the research transferred to Kansas State, why he specified it could never be commercialized. "But Crenshaw won't just let that happen." "No," Webb agreed, "which is why you need to move faster than he can react. Get the research published, get seeds distributed to multiple institutions, create so many copies that taking legal action against one doesn't stop the spread. Make K7 impossible to suppress." They talked strategy for another hour, Webb sharing contacts at agricultural institutions and seed banks around the world, people who'd worked with James Garrett over the years through anonymous correspondence, and who'd honor his legacy by protecting his research. Nate took notes, building a network in his mind, seeing the shape of what needed to happen, even as he worried about whether he and Sam could execute it before AgriCorp's next move. As they were preparing to leave, Webb reached across the table and gripped Nate's shoulder with surprising strength for a man his age. "Your grandfather was the best man I knew, Nathan. He carried burdens that would have broken most people, and he did it without complaint because he understood that some things are worth sacrificing for. You've inherited those burdens now. Don't make his mistake of carrying them alone. Trust your brother. Trust your community. And remember that the people you're fighting don't have any real power except what fear gives them." The flight back to Kansas felt interminable, Nate's mind racing through everything Webb had told him. cataloging threats and opportunities and wondering if they were already too late to prevent AgriCorp from making a decisive move. He'd texted Sam from the airport to let him know he was on his way, but his brother's response had been terse. Need to talk when you get home. Situation developing. Those two sentences had kept Nate anxious through the entire journey, imagining worst-case scenarios, mentally preparing for news that the farm had been seized or Sam arrested on some fabricated charge or worse. The corporate playbook for crushing opposition was well documented, and AgriCorp had proven willing to use every page. The rental car he'd left at Kansas City Airport was where he'd parked it, and he made the drive back to Riley County in record time, pushing the speed limit on highways that cut through landscapes growing increasingly familiar despite his 12-year absence. The drought had worsened even in the few days he'd been gone, fields that had been merely brown now approaching the gray-white of complete death. And Nate wondered how many more families would lose their farms before rain finally came, or before they gave up and accepted whatever terms AgriCorp offered. The Garrett farm appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, and Nate felt his chest tighten at the sight of multiple vehicles parked in the yard. Sam's truck, Vernon Mitchell's Ford, and at least 6 other pickups that belonged to neighboring farmers. Either they were gathering for support or something had happened that required witnesses, and neither option was particularly comforting. He parked and walked toward the house, finding the assembled group on the front porch where his grandfather had spent countless evenings watching the land and thinking thoughts that would remain forever private. Sam stood at the center, looking exhausted but animated, and when he saw Nate, he broke into something that might have been a smile under better circumstances. "You're back. Good. We've got a situation." The farmers made space for Nate on the porch, and he recognized most of them. Harold Cooper, Tom Stevens, the Rodriguez brothers who ran a cattle operation to the east. Others whose names he couldn't quite remember, but whose faces carried the same weathered determination that characterized every successful farmer he'd ever met. "Tell him what you told us," Sam said to Vernon Mitchell. The old farmer cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable being the center of attention, but determined to deliver his message. "I was in town this morning, at the feed store when Robert Sullivan came in. He didn't see me at first, was talking on his phone to someone about the Garrett estate. I heard him say the probate court judge had agreed to an emergency hearing tomorrow morning to address the competing wills. Said something about having documentation that would prove the second will was forged, that James wasn't of sound mind when he supposedly executed it." Nate felt ice forming in his stomach. Sullivan's claiming Grandpa was incompetent? That's what it sounded like. And there's more. Sullivan mentioned that Judge Harrison was sympathetic to arguments about protecting agricultural interests from outside interference. Made it sound like the fix was already in, like they'd decided how tomorrow's hearing would go before it even started. Sam picked up the narrative. "So I did some research into Judge Thomas Harrison. Turns out he's received significant campaign contributions over the years from a political action committee that's funded primarily by agricultural corporations, including substantial donations from a group called Heartland Agricultural Future Fund." "Let me guess," Nate said, "that fund is connected to AgriCorp through about 3 shell companies. But yes, the trail is there if you know where to look. Harrison is bought, Sullivan is working for them, and tomorrow they're going to try to invalidate Grandpa's real will and give everything to me under the forged one. And since I supposedly have that signed agreement with Crenshaw about consulting on proprietary farming methods, they'll argue I have the right to share or sell the K7 research." The elegant simplicity of the trap was almost admirable. AgriCorp had positioned pieces on the board for years, waiting for exactly this moment. With the real will invalidated and Sam theoretically in control under the forged document, they could pressure him to honor his consulting agreement, and if he refused, they'd sue for breach of contract and tie up the estate in litigation that could last years while the research remained in legal limbo. "We're not going to let that happen," Harold Cooper said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be argued out of it. "We've been talking, those of us who knew your grandfather and remember what happened to your father. Enough is enough. They want to play dirty, fine. But they're going to discover that farmers know a thing or two about fighting back." Tom Stevens, a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd been farming longer than Nate had been alive, stepped forward. "We're going to pack that courtroom tomorrow. Every farmer they've pressured, every family that's lost land to their shell companies, everyone who's tired of watching corporate interests destroy what our grandparents built. We're going to show that judge that the whole county is watching, and if he tries to rule against you based on bought and paid for testimony, we'll make sure everyone knows exactly why. The plan had obvious risks. Judicial intimidation could backfire, could give Harrison justification to rule against them out of spite or principle. But Nate also understood the power of community pressure in small counties where judges and sheriffs and county commissioners had to live among the people they governed, had to look them in the eye at church and the grocery store and Little League games. There's something else, Sam added, and Nate could hear hesitation in his brother's voice. Dr. Parker called this afternoon. She's completed preliminary analysis of the K7 seeds, and she wants to publish the results immediately. She says the research is significant enough that it could change agricultural policy worldwide, but she needs our permission to move forward since we're the legal inheritors. This was the moment Webb had talked about, the opportunity to make K7 public before AgriCorp could suppress or control it. But it was also a declaration of war, a line crossed from which there would be no retreat. If we publish, Nate said slowly, thinking through implications, AgriCorp loses any incentive to play the long game. They'll know they've lost control, and their response will be immediate and probably violent. They've already burned Vernon's barn, Harold pointed out. They killed your father. How much more violent can they get? It was a fair question, though Nate suspected they hadn't yet seen the full extent of what AgriCorp was willing to do when billions of dollars in potential profit were at stake. But Webb's words echoed in his mind. The people you're fighting don't have any real power except what fear gives them. And maybe that was true. Maybe the secret to beating them was refusing to be afraid, refusing to back down, forcing them to operate in the open where their tactics could be exposed and condemned. We publish, Nate decided. Tomorrow, as soon as the hearing is over, regardless of how it goes. Dr. Parker gets the green light to share the research with every agricultural institution she trusts. We flood the world with K7 before anyone can stop us. Sam nodded, relief visible in his expression. I was hoping you'd say that. The farmers stayed late into the evening, planning their courtroom presence for the next day, discussing who would sit where and who would speak if given the opportunity. Someone suggested contacting local news, making sure the hearing was covered by media that couldn't be easily controlled or dismissed. Vernon volunteered to reach out to farming associations in neighboring counties, expanding the circle of witnesses and support. It felt like preparing for battle, which Nate supposed they were, though the weapons were testimony and public opinion rather than anything that would draw blood. Though given what had happened to his father in Vernon's equipment shed, he couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that blood might be drawn before this was finished. After the others had left, Nate and Sam sat in the kitchen going through their grandfather's journals one more time, looking for any detail they might have missed, any additional evidence that could support their case in court. The entries read like love letters to the land, detailed observations about soil composition and weather patterns and the subtle variations between seed generations that had allowed K7 to evolve from military experiment to agricultural miracle. He really believed in this, Sam said, running his finger along a passage from 1989 where James had written about the responsibility of knowledge and the moral imperative to share discoveries that could reduce human suffering. Believed it enough to die protecting it. We're not going to die, Nate replied, trying to inject confidence he didn't entirely feel. We're going to win. For him, for Dad, for everyone who's ever had their livelihood destroyed by corporations that see people as obstacles. Sam looked at his brother, really looked at him, for the first time since Nate had returned from Washington. And something passed between them that didn't require words. Recognition, maybe, of the fact that they were in this together now, that 12 years of distance and different choices had been bridged by shared crisis and shared purpose. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Crenshaw earlier, Sam said quietly. I thought I could handle it alone, thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it. I'm sorry I left, Nate countered. I'm sorry I made you carry this place by yourself for 12 years while I wrote papers about agricultural policy from an office that's never seen a real farm. They sat in silence after that, letting forgiveness hang unspoken in the air between them, and outside the Kansas night deepened toward the kind of darkness that only exists far from cities, where the stars multiply until they seem to outnumber the spaces between them, and the land stretches out in all directions like an ocean frozen in time. The emergency probate hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning in the county courthouse, and by 8:30 the parking lot was already full, trucks and sedans, and even a few tractors driven in by farmers who'd left their fields unattended to bear witness. Nate counted at least 60 people gathering on the courthouse steps, more than he'd expected. And when he and Sam arrived, the crowd parted to let them through with nods of solidarity that felt like armor against what was coming. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Nate remembered from childhood trips to see his father handle zoning issues or property disputes. Wood-paneled walls, uncomfortable benches for spectators, and at the front, a raised bench where Judge Thomas Harrison would preside over proceedings that would determine whether the Garrett family retained control of their legacy or lost it to legal maneuvering and corporate influence. Robert Sullivan was already present, sitting at the plaintiff's table with two associates from a law firm in Topeka, all three men wearing suits that cost more than most of the farmers in attendance made in a month. David Crenshaw sat behind them in the first row of spectator seating, his presence a clear message about who was really orchestrating this hearing. Maria Chen, the lawyer Nate had hired in Topeka after determining Sullivan couldn't be trusted, arrived with 5 minutes to spare, carrying a briefcase full of documents, and wearing an expression that suggested she'd been looking forward to this fight. She was in her 40s, second-generation Chinese-American, and had built a reputation defending family farms against corporate acquisition tactics. When she saw the packed courtroom, she smiled. "Nothing judges hate more than making unpopular decisions in front of witnesses," she murmured to Nate as she took her seat. "This is good." Judge Harrison entered at exactly 9 o'clock, a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of face that looked used to being obeyed. He surveyed the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure, his gaze lingering on the farmers who'd filled every available seat and were standing along the back wall. "This court will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from 20 years on the bench. "I understand emotions are running high given the nature of this case, but I will not tolerate disruptions. Anyone who cannot conduct themselves appropriately will be removed." Sullivan stood to present his case, and Nate watched the performance with growing anger as the lawyer methodically built an argument that Colonel James Garrett had been suffering from dementia in his final months, that the second will had been executed under questionable circumstances, that the entire situation suggested exploitation of an elderly man by parties unknown. He presented testimony from a doctor who treated James for high blood pressure and claimed to have noticed signs of cognitive decline, though Nate knew his grandfather had been mentally sharp until the day he died. He showed the court the consulting agreement Sam had signed while intoxicated, arguing it demonstrated James's grandson intended to commercialize family assets, and therefore the first will's division of property made more sense than the second will's restrictions. It was a masterclass in legal manipulation, taking facts and twisting them just enough to create reasonable doubt while never quite crossing into obvious falsehood. And through it all, Judge Harrison listened with an expression that suggested he was finding Sullivan's arguments persuasive. When it was Maria Chen's turn to present, she stood and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I could spend hours refuting Mr. Sullivan's mischaracterizations and presenting evidence of Colonel Garrett's mental competence. But instead, I'm going to address the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of this proceeding." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Counselor, I'd advise caution in your choice of words." "I choose them deliberately, Your Honor. This isn't a good faith dispute about a deceased man's intentions. This is corporate warfare disguised as probate procedure, and everyone in this courtroom knows it." She presented the evidence Nate had gathered: Sullivan's emails discussing strategy with Crenshaw, the campaign contributions from agricultural PACs to Harrison's election fund, the pattern of AgriCorp shell companies buying up surrounding properties, the private investigator's report about Daniel Garrett's murder. "The plaintiffs aren't arguing about which will represents James Garrett's true intentions," Chen continued. "They're arguing for the right to steal research that could benefit millions of people and put it in the hands of a corporation with a documented history of prioritizing profit over human welfare. And they're using this court to legitimize that theft." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Harrison's gavel came down hard. "Order! I'll have order or I'll clear this room." But Chen wasn't finished. "I'm requesting this court recuse itself from this case due to clear conflicts of interest. I'm also requesting that all documentation be turned over to the State Attorney General for investigation of potential judicial corruption and corporate conspiracy." Sullivan shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. These accusations are baseless and defamatory." "Are they?" Chen shot back. "Then explain the campaign contributions. Explain the emails. Explain why AgriCorp's representative is sitting in this courtroom watching proceedings that should be a simple family matter. Harrison's face had gone red, and Nate couldn't tell if it was from anger or shame or fear of exposure. The judge's gavel came down again, the sound like a gunshot in the tense silence. This hearing is adjourned. All parties will return at 2 o'clock this afternoon, at which time I will render my decision. This court is dismissed. He left the bench quickly, his robes billowing behind him, and Nate watched Sullivan and Crenshaw huddle together in urgent conversation, their body language suggesting things had not gone according to plan. The farmers in the courtroom stood as one, a silent show of support that needed no words. And as Nate and Sam made their way out of the courthouse, hands reached out to grip their shoulders. Voices murmured encouragement. And for the first time since his grandfather's death, Nate felt like they might actually win this fight. They reconvened at the farm during the lunch break, too anxious to eat but gathering anyway in the kitchen that had become their war room. Dr. Parker called to say she had the research ready for publication and could send it to journals within an hour if they gave the word. News crews had started calling, alerted by farmers who'd attended the hearing and wanted the story told. And Vernon Mitchell reported that Sheriff Bradley had received calls from at least 20 people demanding an investigation into AgriCorp's activities in the county. "The tide is turning," Sam said, and he sounded surprised that standing up had actually worked. But Nate couldn't shake a sense of forbidding, a feeling that they were missing something, that Crenshaw wouldn't have shown up at the courthouse unless he had contingencies for exactly this scenario. Men who orchestrated murders and burned buildings didn't panic when legal strategies failed. They adapted, and Nate suspected the adaptation was already in motion. His suspicions proved correct 30 minutes before they were due back in court when Sam's phone rang with a number neither of them recognized. Sam answered on speaker, and David Crenshaw's cultured voice filled the kitchen like poison gas. "Gentlemen, I wanted to reach out before this afternoon's hearing to present one final opportunity for reasonable resolution. I recognize that emotions have escalated beyond what anyone intended, and I believe it's in everyone's interest to de-escalate before permanent damage is done. We're not interested in your offers," Nate said coldly. "Not even an offer that includes complete amnesty for your brother's consulting agreement and full market value purchase of the farm with a bonus that would make both of you independently wealthy. I'm authorized to offer $12 million for the property and exclusive rights to K7. That's generational wealth, gentlemen, enough to start over anywhere you choose." Sam's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady when he responded. "The farm isn't for sale. The research isn't for sale. And no amount of money is going to change that." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Crenshaw spoke again, his tone had shifted from conciliatory to something harder, more dangerous. "I see. Then I suppose you've left me no choice but to proceed with more aggressive measures. I wanted you to know that I gave you every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. What happens next is on you." The line went dead, and Nate and Sam looked at each other, both hearing the threat beneath the civilized words. "We need to be careful," Nate said, "very careful. He's going to make a move, and it's going to be something we're not expecting." They arrived back at the courthouse at 1:45 to find the parking lot even more crowded than it had been that morning. But this time there were also state police vehicles, and as Nate and Sam approached the entrance, they saw Judge Harrison being escorted out by two officers, his face ashen, his hands not quite cuffed, but clearly not free to leave. Maria Chen met them at the door, her expression caught between triumph and concern. "The Attorney General's office moved faster than I expected. They're taking Harrison in for questioning about the campaign contributions and potential judicial corruption. The hearing's been postponed indefinitely, and a new judge will be assigned to the case. We won." But as Nate watched more police vehicles arrive, watched Harrison being placed in an unmarked car, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Somewhere, David Crenshaw was already planning his next move, already positioning pieces on a board that extended far beyond a Kansas courtroom. And whatever that move was, Nate suspected it would make everything that had come before look like a gentle opening gambit. The victory celebration at the Garrett farm that evening was tempered by a shared understanding that battles won in courtrooms could be lost on darker fields where rules didn't apply and witnesses couldn't testify. 40 farmers gathered in the equipment shed where Sam had set up folding tables and brought out the whiskey their grandfather had kept for special occasions. The good stuff that had survived prohibition, hidden in the basement, and now marked moments when words alone weren't enough to express what needed to be said. Nate stood near the door watching his brother move through the crowd, accepting handshakes and backslaps from men who'd watched Sam grow up, who'd helped him through the lean years after their father died, who understood that tonight's gathering was both celebration and preparation for whatever came next. The legal system had worked, more or less, but everyone present knew that AgriCorp didn't limit themselves to legal remedies when billions of dollars hung in the balance. Vernon Mitchell found Nate in his quiet corner, the old farmer moving slowly, still recovering from the loss of his equipment, shed but present because absence would have meant surrender. Your grandfather would be proud, Vernon said, his voice rough from smoke inhalation and age. Standing up to them like you did. Not many would have the spine for it. I had help, Nate replied, gesturing to the assembled farmers. Couldn't have done it alone. That's the point, son. Your generation sometimes forgets that strength isn't individual. It's collective. One man can be broken. A community is considerably harder to destroy. The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, and as Vernon moved away to talk with Harold Cooper, Nate noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. Several of the farmers were wearing what looked like small radios clipped to their belts, the kind of two-way communication devices that hunting parties or construction crews might use. When he looked closer, he saw Tom Stevens adjusting the volume on his and Harold Cooper responding to something that came through his earpiece. Sam noticed Nate's attention and walked over, lowering his voice. Vernon's idea. After his barn burned, he convinced about 15 of us to get walkie-talkies, create a neighborhood watch network. We've been monitoring our properties and each other's since then. Someone sees something suspicious, they call it in, and the rest of us can respond faster than the sheriff ever could. The practicality of it struck Nate as both brilliant and sobering. These weren't paranoid survivalists. They were farmers who'd learned that official protection couldn't always reach remote properties in time to prevent damage, and who'd decided that looking out for each other was the only reliable defense they had. How far does the network reach? Nate asked. About 5 miles radius from here, Sam replied. Covers most of the farms between our place and town. We've got a central frequency everyone monitors, plus individual channels for specific situations. Nate filed this information away, understanding now how the farmers had shown up so quickly at Vernon's barn fire, how news traveled through this community faster than any phone tree could manage. But he also understood that tonight, with Crenshaw's threat still hanging in the air, that network might be the only thing standing between them and whatever desperate measures a cornered corporation might deploy. Dr. Helen Parker arrived around 8 o'clock, having made the drive from Manhattan after spending the day coordinating with colleagues at universities across the country. She carried a tablet loaded with emails and preliminary analyses, her academic excitement barely contained as she showed Nate and Sam the responses she'd received from research institutions. The interest is extraordinary, she explained, scrolling through message after message. 17 universities want seed samples for their own testing. The USDA's Agricultural Research Service wants to establish field trials in 6 different climate zones. And I've had 3 calls from international agricultural organizations asking about access to the research for developing nations. Sam leaned over to read one of the emails, his expression shifting from curiosity to something like awe. They're saying this could help prevent famines. Not just prevent, Parker corrected. Potentially eliminate crop failures in regions that currently can't sustain reliable agriculture because of drought or soil quality. Your grandfather's work represents a fundamental shift in how we approach food security. It's not an exaggeration to say this could save millions of lives over the coming decades. The magnitude of that statement hung in the air between them, and Nate felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier across his shoulders. They weren't just fighting to protect family property anymore. They were fighting to ensure that knowledge which could prevent human suffering wasn't locked away behind patents and profit margins. When can you publish? Nate asked. I prepared a paper for immediate submission to Nature and Science, Parker replied. With your permission, I can send it tonight. Once it's in the peer review system, the information becomes effectively impossible to suppress. Too many people will have seen it. Too many institutions will have copies of the data. Nate looked at Sam, seeing his own thoughts reflected in his brother's face. This was the point of no return, the moment when they moved from defensive legal maneuvering to active warfare against interests that had proven willing to kill to protect their market position. Do it, Sam said. Publish everything. Let the whole world know what Grandpa created. Parker nodded and stepped away to make the necessary calls. And Nate watched her go, wondering if they'd just signed their own death warrants or taken the first real step toward honoring their grandfather's sacrifice. The farmers began departing around 9:30, men with early morning routines and livestock that didn't care about legal victories or corporate conspiracies. They left in a procession of headlights and diesel engines, but as Vernon was preparing to leave, he pulled both brothers aside. "I want you boys to have this," he said, handing Sam a walkie-talkie identical to the ones Nate had noticed earlier. "Channel 7 is our emergency frequency. You need help anytime, day or night. You key that channel and say the word. There'll be people here inside 15 minutes. "Vernon, you don't have to," Sam started, but the old farmer cut him off with a gesture. "After what happened to my barn, I know exactly what we're dealing with. And I know men like Crenshaw don't take losses well. They're most dangerous when they've got nothing left to lose through legitimate channels." He looked at both brothers seriously. "Keep that radio on you. Don't be heroes. If something feels wrong, call it in." After Vernon had gone, Nate and Sam secured the farm with a thoroughness that would have seemed paranoid a week ago, but now felt like basic precaution. They checked the locks on the equipment shed, the barn, the house itself. Sam retrieved a shotgun from the gun cabinet their father had installed decades ago, and Nate thought about the Colt 1911 in his luggage upstairs, still wrapped in its towel, waiting for a situation he hoped wouldn't come. They set the walkie-talkie on the kitchen table where they could hear it clearly, the device hissing softly with occasional bursts of static as farmers across the network checked in with their positions. It was oddly comforting knowing that invisible lines of communication connected them to people who'd proven they were willing to help when it mattered. They took turns on watch that night, one sleeping while the other sat on the porch with coffee and weapons, listening to the sounds of the Kansas darkness and trying to distinguish normal night noises from potential threats. Nate took the first shift, sitting in his grandfather's old rocking chair and watching the shadows shift across the yard as clouds moved across the moon. Around 2 in the morning, Nate's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief and unsigned. "The irrigation system on your northeast quarter section has developed a significant leak. You might want to check it before you lose the entire field." Every instinct Nate had developed in his years analyzing policy and reading between political lines told him this was wrong. The timing was too convenient, the anonymous warning too perfectly designed to draw them away from the house and into an exposed position. But the northeast quarter section was also where Sam had planted the last viable crop they had, wheat that wasn't K7, but represented their only potential income for the year. If the irrigation system actually had failed there, they couldn't afford to ignore it. Nate went inside and woke Sam, showing him the text. His brother's expression shifted from sleep-fogged confusion to sharp alertness. "Could be legitimate," Sam said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "That system is old. Things break." At 2 in the morning, right after we humiliate Agricorp in court, Sam reached for the walkie-talkie on the kitchen table, keying the microphone. "This is Sam Garrett. Anyone on Channel 7, we've got a potential situation. Received an anonymous text about irrigation failure on our northeast section. Feels like a setup." The radio crackled to life almost immediately with Vernon Mitchell's voice. "Copy that, Sam. What's your plan?" "Going to check it out, but staying alert. If you don't hear from us in 30 minutes, something's wrong." "Harold and I are closer to your northeast corner than you are," Vernon replied. "We'll position ourselves along the tree line there. Keep an eye out. You see anything suspicious? You get out and we'll be there." Other voices chimed in, farmers confirming their positions, creating an invisible perimeter of watchers who could respond if needed. Nate felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders, understanding now how the community network functioned not just as communication, but as mutual protection. They took Sam's truck, the four-wheel drive Ford that had been through more mud and weather than most vehicles saw in 10 lifetimes, and drove slowly across the access road that cut through the property toward the northeast fields. Nate kept the walkie-talkie in one hand and his phone in the other, ready to call for help if needed, while Sam drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the shotgun propped against the center console. The irrigation system was exactly where the text had indicated, and sure enough, water was spraying from a broken coupling, creating a muddy crater that was rapidly expanding as precious groundwater disappeared into soil too dry to hold it. Sam killed the engine and climbed out, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the damage. Nate followed, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, scanning the darkness beyond the headlights for movement or threats. He keyed the walkie-talkie. Vernon, we're at the site. Irrigation coupling is definitely damaged. Looks deliberate. We see you, Vernon's voice came back. You've got two vehicles approaching fast from the county road. Black SUVs, same ones from before. Before Nate could respond, headlights appeared on the horizon. Multiple vehicles approaching fast from the direction Vernon had indicated. Sam saw them at the same time and both brothers moved instinctively back toward their truck. But the approaching vehicles were faster, newer, positioned to cut off any escape route. Three black SUVs formed a semicircle around Sam's truck, their high beams creating a wall of light that made it impossible to see who or what was behind them. Doors opened and figures emerged, 6 men in dark clothing that could have been security contractor gear or just expensive tactical fashion. And walking behind them, casual as if he were arriving at a business meeting, was David Crenshaw. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the field, "I apologize for the dramatic staging, but we need to have a conversation without interruption. And your farmhouse seemed to be attracting too many visitors lately." Nate's hand tightened on the walkie-talkie, and he saw Sam shift his grip on the shotgun, preparing for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. "We got nothing to say to you," Samson called back. "Get off our property before I call the sheriff." Crenshaw laughed, a sound without humor. "The sheriff is currently dealing with a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 77. Tragic really, though everyone will survive. But it means response time to this remote corner of your property would be at least 30 minutes. Plenty of time for our conversation." Nate keyed the walkie-talkie, keeping it low and out of sight. "Vernon, we need help. 6 contractors plus Crenshaw, armed. Already moving." Vernon's voice came back immediately. "Hold tight. 3 minutes." Crenshaw stepped forward into the light, close enough now that Nate could see his expression clearly. Gone was the polished corporate veneer, replaced by something harder, more desperate. This was a man who'd invested years in a strategy that was collapsing, and desperation made even civilized men dangerous. "I want you to understand something," Crenshaw continued. "The courtroom theater today, the judge's arrest, the attorney general's investigation, none of that actually matters. You've won a temporary victory in a system that can be manipulated, delayed, and eventually overcome with sufficient resources and patience. But you've also triggered responses you're not equipped to handle." "Is that a threat?" Nate asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "It's a statement of fact. AgriCorp isn't just a corporation. It's part of a network of agricultural interests that control food production in 17 countries. The research your grandfather developed threatens existing patent portfolios worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The people who hold those patents don't care about Kansas farmers or American courts. They care about protecting their investments by any means necessary." Sam raised the shotgun slightly, not quite pointing it, but making the threat clear. "So you brought hired muscle to what? Kill us? That worked so well with our father." Something flickered across Crenshaw's face at the mention of Daniel Garrett, something that might have been genuine regret before his corporate mask reasserted itself. "Your father's death was an unfortunate escalation by regional management that I had no part in authorizing. I'm here to prevent a repeat of that mistake, not to create more bodies. I'm offering you one final opportunity to walk away from this with your lives and enough money to start over anywhere in the world." "And if we refuse?" Nate asked, playing for time while Vernon and the others moved into position. Crenshaw gestured to the men standing behind him. "Then my employers will pursue other options, and I won't be able to control the outcome. You need to understand that publishing that research doesn't protect you. It makes you a liability that needs to be eliminated before you can testify about corporate wrongdoing or inspire others to resist acquisition efforts." The admission was startling in its candor, and Nate realized Crenshaw wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to deliver an ultimatum before washing his hands of whatever came next. The corporate representative had probably already written his report about the Garrett brothers' unfortunate refusal to accept reasonable terms, setting up justification for whatever violence was coming. "We're not accepting your offer," Nate said clearly, wanting there to be no ambiguity in the record of this conversation. "We're not selling the farm, we're not giving you the research, and we're not backing down from publishing everything we know about AgriCorp's illegal activities." Crenshaw nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response but had needed to hear it confirmed. "Then I've done what I came to do. Consider yourselves warned. What happens next is on you." He turned and walked back toward his SUV, and Nate expected the security contractors to follow, but instead they remained in position, hands moving to weapons concealed under their jackets. The realization hit like ice water. Crenshaw wasn't here to warn them. He was here to establish an alibi while his hired men finished what his company had started 18 years ago with Daniel Garrett. Sam, Nate said quietly, keying the walkie-talkie with his other hand. Vernon, we need you now. But before either brother could move or the contractors could draw their weapons, headlights appeared from multiple directions. Not just Vernon and Harold's trucks, but at least a dozen vehicles approaching from the tree lines and access roads that surrounded this corner of the property. The farmers had positioned themselves in a perimeter during the conversation, and now they were closing in, trucks forming a protective circle around the Garrett brothers. Doors opened and men emerged, and while none of them were pointing weapons, the hunting rifles and shotguns they carried were clearly visible in the headlights. Vernon Mitchell stepped forward, moving with the deliberate confidence of a man who'd lived too long to be easily intimidated. "Gentlemen from AgriCorp," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades in this county. "I believe you're trespassing on private property. The Garrett brothers have asked you to leave. I'd suggest you comply before this situation becomes any more unpleasant than it already is." The security contractors looked to Crenshaw for guidance, but the corporate representative had gone pale, clearly not having anticipated this level of organized resistance. One man with a gun was a threat. 15 men with weapons and local knowledge and legitimate reason to be on this property was a tactical nightmare that couldn't be resolved without creating exactly the kind of public incident AgriCorp needed to avoid. Tom Stevens had been recording the entire confrontation on his phone, as had several other farmers. Harold Cooper held up his device. "We've got video of everything you said, Mr. Crenshaw. The threats, the admission about being unable to control what comes next. Might make interesting evidence in the Attorney General's investigation." Crenshaw climbed into his SUV, his corporate composure finally cracking. "This isn't over. You're making enemies you can't afford." "We're protecting our neighbors," Vernon replied calmly. "That's what communities do. You might want to explain that concept to your employers." The SUVs departed in a spray of gravel and dust, their expensive vehicles looking oddly diminished against the backdrop of farm trucks and the men who worked land rather than quarterly reports. After they disappeared, the assembled farmers approached, and Nate saw that several of them were still recording, documenting everything in case it became evidence later. "Figured you boys might need backup," Harold Cooper explained. "Vernon called us after he left the farm earlier, said he had a bad feeling, and we decided to position ourselves around your property boundaries. When you reported the irrigation problem, we moved into closer positions. Good thing, too." Sam was staring at the farmers who'd driven into a potential gunfight to protect people who weren't even family, his expression caught between gratitude and disbelief. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," Tom Stevens replied with a shrug. "Difference is there's 15 of us and 2 of you. Better odds this way." They secured the sabotaged irrigation system with temporary repairs, then formed a convoy back to the farmhouse. Nobody willing to leave the Garrett brothers exposed until sunrise made ambush less likely. The farmers took turns on watch throughout the rest of the night, some sleeping in their trucks, others sitting on the porch with coffee and weapons. And Nate was struck by the realization that this was what his grandfather had meant about community being stronger than corporations. Dawn broke gray and cool, the kind of morning that promised rain but probably wouldn't deliver. And as the farmers began departing to tend their own operations, Dr. Parker's car appeared on the access road. She climbed out looking exhausted but energized, waving a tablet like it contained treasure maps. "The paper's published," she announced without preamble. "Nature fast-tracked the review because of the significance, and Science is running it simultaneously. As of 6 this morning Eastern Time, the full Case 7 research is available to anyone with internet access." The news should have felt like victory, but Nate couldn't shake the image of Crenshaw's face the night before, the desperation of a man watching his strategy collapse. Published research meant AgriCorp had lost the war for exclusive control, but it also meant they had nothing left to lose by pursuing more violent options. "We need to move the operation," Nate said, making a decision that had been forming since the confrontation. "Get the remaining seed samples somewhere secure, somewhere AgriCorp can't destroy them even if they burn down this entire farm." Parker nodded. I've arranged secure storage at 3 different universities plus the USDA seed bank in Fort Collins. We can have everything moved within 48 hours. Over breakfast, they planned the logistics while Vernon and Harold stayed to help. The two old farmers contributing the kind of practical knowledge that came from decades of moving livestock and equipment in conditions that didn't forgive mistakes. By mid-morning, they had a strategy. Parker would coordinate the university transfers, while Sam and Nate secured the underground chamber and prepared the journals for transport. But as they were finishing their planning session, Sam's phone rang with a call from Robert Sullivan, and despite everything, Sam put it on speaker. "Mr. Garrett," Sullivan's voice came through, formal and strained. "I'm calling to inform you that I'm withdrawing as counsel for your grandfather's estate. I've also provided testimony to the Attorney General's office regarding my communications with AgriCorp representatives. I wanted you to know before it becomes public." There was a pause, then Sullivan continued, his voice softer. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies. I let financial considerations override my professional and ethical obligations. I facilitated actions that contributed to your father's death, and I've carried that guilt for 18 years. I can't undo what I did, but I can at least stop making it worse." Sam's jaw tightened, anger and something like pity warring in his expression. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "Because I saw you standing up to them in that courtroom, and I remembered what it felt like to have principles worth defending. Your family has paid enough for my cowardice. I won't ask for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know the truth." The line went dead and Nate and Sam looked at each other, processing this unexpected defection from AgriCorp's network of collaborators. "People can change," Vernon observed. "Sometimes it takes witnessing real courage to remember they have a spine." Sullivan's testimony became public that afternoon, a detailed confession to the Attorney General that named names and provided documentation of AgriCorp's illegal activities going back 20 years. Within hours, federal investigators had opened criminal inquiries, subpoenas were issued, and the story exploded across agricultural trade publications and eventually mainstream news. By evening, the Garrett farm was surrounded by satellite trucks and reporters, all wanting interviews with the brothers who'd stood up to corporate agriculture and exposed a conspiracy that reached from Kansas courtrooms to international patent portfolios. Nate fielded the media requests while Sam worked with Parker to coordinate the seed transfers, and somewhere in the chaos of it all, Nate realized they'd achieved something his grandfather had only dreamed of. They'd made the fight public. Corporations operated in darkness, using legal complexity and intimidation to keep their targets isolated and afraid. But light was proving to be an effective weapon. Every news report, every interview, every social media post about K7 and the Garrett family's resistance created witnesses, created public accountability, created a situation where violence would be too obvious, too traceable to deploy without consequences. That night, as Nate sat on the porch watching the news vans pack up and depart, his phone rang with a Virginia area code. Marcus Webb's voice came through, urgent and concerned. "Nathan, I've been monitoring the situation through my old contacts. You need to know that AgriCorp's parent company is in full crisis mode. Their stock has dropped 15% since the publication. They're facing criminal investigations in 3 countries, and their board is looking for scapegoats. That makes them incredibly dangerous." "We've got community support," Nate replied. "Media attention, federal investigators watching. What can they really do at this point?" Desperate corporations with billions at stake don't think rationally. They think in terms of damage control and acceptable losses. I've seen companies burn facilities to destroy evidence. I've seen them sacrifice entire divisions to protect core operations. You and your brother represent an existential threat to their business model. Don't underestimate what they might do. Webb's warning echoed in Nate's mind long after the call ended, mixing with memories of his father's death and Vernon's burned equipment and the cold calculation in Crenshaw's eyes during their confrontation. They'd won multiple battles, but the war was entering its most dangerous phase, the moment when cornered predators became most vicious. The attack came 3 days later, not with guns or hired contractors, but with bureaucratic weapons that proved equally devastating. First came the EPA inspection of the farm's water usage, citing anonymous complaints about illegal irrigation during drought restrictions. Then the USDA announced a surprise inspection of grain storage facilities over concerns about potential contamination. The county building inspector showed up with paperwork suggesting the farmhouse was in violation of updated codes and might be condemned pending costly repairs. Each inspection, each citation, each bureaucratic obstacle was individually defensible, but collectively represented a coordinated assault designed to drain resources and create legal entanglements that would tie up the farm in regulatory hell for years. It was corporate warfare translated into official channels, using the machinery of government to achieve what direct violence no longer could. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork," Sam said, staring at the stack of citations and compliance orders that had accumulated in just 72 hours. "Force us to spend everything we have on lawyers and inspections and remediation until we've got nothing left to fight with." Nate was reading through the EPA findings, noting inconsistencies and factual errors that suggested the inspector had been working from predetermined conclusions rather than actual observations. These can be challenged. Most of them are either invalid or based on misapplied regulations. "Challenging them takes time and money we don't have," Sam countered. "That's the point. They don't need to win. They just need to make fighting so expensive we give up." It was a devastatingly effective strategy, and Nate could see the exhaustion in his brother's face, the weight of fighting battles on multiple fronts, while trying to keep a farm operational during the worst drought in decades. But before despair could take hold, Vernon Mitchell's truck appeared in the driveway, followed by Harold Cooper's, and then Tom Stevens, until a dozen vehicles were parked in the yard and farmers were gathering in the equipment shed for what was becoming a nightly war council. "We've been talking," Vernon announced, his voice carrying the authority of consensus. "Every one of us has dealt with regulatory harassment at some point. Between us, we know every inspector, every local official, every way to challenge citations through proper channels. And we've pooled resources to hire a law firm that specializes in agricultural regulatory defense." Harold Cooper stepped forward with a folder of documents. "We've also filed countercomplaints with the EPA about suspiciously timed inspections and potential inspector bias. And we've contacted our Congresswoman's office about possible abuse of regulatory authority. She's interested in making this a campaign issue." The relief Nate felt was almost physical, the realization that they weren't fighting alone, that community support extended beyond symbolic gestures to actual material aid. These farmers were investing their own limited resources to protect the Garrett farm, not because they expected repayment, but because they understood that losing this fight meant everyone lost. Over the next week, the regulatory assault was systematically dismantled through a combination of legal challenges, political pressure, and careful documentation of improprieties. The EPA inspector was reassigned pending investigation. The USDA inspection was revealed to be based on false reports. The building inspector's citations were thrown out by his own supervisor after independent review found them without merit. AgriCorp was learning that small-town communities had their own forms of power, their own networks and knowledge that could counter corporate influence when properly mobilized. But Nate knew they were running out of time. The drought was entering its 6th month, crop futures were collapsing, and banks were becoming increasingly nervous about agricultural loans in the region. Economic pressure might accomplish what legal and regulatory pressure hadn't. The call from First Kansas Bank came on a Tuesday morning, the branch manager's voice professionally sympathetic as he explained that the bank was calling in the farm's mortgage. Market conditions, drought impacts, regulatory uncertainties, all combining to make the loan too risky to carry. They were offering 60 days to arrange refinancing or face foreclosure proceedings. Sam's face went white as he listened, and Nate felt rage building in his chest. This was the end game AgriCorp had been positioning toward all along. Control the bank, create enough chaos and uncertainty that the loan became untenable, force a foreclosure sale where they could acquire the property at a fraction of its value while appearing to simply be prudent investors taking advantage of market opportunities. "Who bought the controlling interest in First Kansas?" Nate asked the branch manager. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the bank's ownership structure." "Let me guess. A private equity firm with connections to agricultural interests. Maybe one that's funded by the same people who've been trying to acquire this farm for 20 years. The manager didn't confirm or deny, simply repeated that they had 60 days before foreclosure proceedings would begin, and then the line went dead. Sam stood and walked to the window, staring out at fields that represented 6 generations of work, of sacrifice, of holding on to something when easier paths beckoned. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. We can't refinance. No bank is going to touch us with all the regulatory flags and legal uncertainty. And we don't have anything close to the cash to pay off the mortgage. We're going to lose the farm. But Nate was already on his phone calling Dr. Parker because an idea was forming, desperate, impossibly impossible, but the only option he could see that didn't end in surrender. How many universities want K7 seed samples, he asked when Parker answered. 73 at last count. Why? And how many of them have agricultural endowments or research budgets? There was a pause as Parker caught up to his thinking. Most of them? Nathan, what are you planning? A consortium. Academic institutions pooling resources to purchase the farm as a living research facility. They get access to the original growing conditions, ongoing research opportunities, and the goodwill of protecting important agricultural heritage. We get to keep working the land and ensure K7 development continues. Parker was quiet for a long moment, and Nate could almost hear her mind working through the logistics, the political complications, the potential objections, and how to overcome them. It's unprecedented, she said finally, but it might work. The publicity around K7 has created enormous interest, and several institutions have reached out asking about ways to support continued research. If I can structure it properly, present it as an investment in agricultural science rather than a charity case. You've got a week to make it happen, Nate said. After that, we're out of options. The next 7 days were a blur of phone calls, virtual meetings, legal consultations, and more stress than Nate had experienced even in his most intense periods at the Department of Agriculture. Parker worked 18-hour days coordinating between university administrators, research directors, legal departments, and the complex web of academic politics that governs such decisions. Meanwhile, Nate and Sam kept the farm running, maintained their media presence, and tried not to think about what would happen if the consortium plan fell through. Support came from unexpected quarters. The congresswoman Harold Cooper had contacted made the Garrett farm a centerpiece of her agricultural policy platform, touring the property with news cameras and promising federal support for protecting family farms from corporate predation. Environmental organizations highlighted K7 as a climate adaptation success story. Even international agricultural agencies weighed in, arguing that the research represented a global public good that needed protection. The pressure worked. On day 6 of their countdown to foreclosure, Dr. Parker called with news that a consortium of 12 universities had agreed to jointly purchase the farm for its appraised value, with the Garrett brothers retaining operational control and a minority ownership stake. The deal included funding for continued research, infrastructure improvements, and a guarantee that K7 would remain in the public domain. We did it, Parker said, and Nate could hear exhaustion and triumph in her voice. The paperwork is being expedited. We'll have everything finalized before the bank's deadline. Nate found Sam in the barn, working on the tractor because physical labor was how his brother processed stress and uncertainty. When Nate shared the news, Sam's hand stilled on the wrench he'd been holding, and for a long moment he just stood there letting the information sink in. We're not losing the farm, Sam said finally, as if he needed to hear the words out loud to believe them. We're not losing the farm, Nate confirmed, and AgriCorp is losing the war. That evening, as word spread through the county about the consortium deal, farmers began arriving at the Garrett property in an impromptu celebration that felt like the mirror image of the funeral gathering that had started everything. But this time there was hope instead of grief, community instead of isolation, and a shared understanding that they'd achieved something that mattered beyond property rights or corporate defeats. They'd proven that people working together could stand against systems designed to crush individual resistance. They'd shown that knowledge shared was stronger than knowledge hoarded, and they'd honored the sacrifice of a man who'd spent 60 years protecting research he believed could help feed a hungry world. As Nate stood on the porch watching the celebration, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he opened it. Congratulations on your Pyrrhic victory. You've saved one farm while painting a target on every institution that supported you. Sleep well knowing you've endangered everyone who helped you. This isn't over, it's just beginning. The message was unsigned, but Nate recognized the tone, the calculated malice of David Crenshaw's final warning. AgriCorp had lost this battle, but the war for control of global agriculture would continue in other places. against other targets who might not have the same community support or media attention or stubborn refusal to yield. But tonight, at least, they could celebrate survival and resistance and the stubborn faith that doing the right thing mattered even when it cost everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new battles in a war that was far from over. Tonight, though, they'd won. And in Kansas, during the worst drought in 50 years, with corporations and corrupt officials arrayed against them, that victory meant everything. The Kansas sky had finally broken its drought on the morning the consortium paperwork was finalized, rain arriving in sheets that turned dust to mud and filled the air with that particular smell of earth, remembering what water felt like. Nate stood on the porch watching it fall, thinking about his grandfather's journal entry from 40 years ago that had described rain as a promise the land made to those patient enough to wait for it. The old colonel had been patient for 6 decades, waiting for the right people to inherit his secrets, and somehow his faith had been rewarded. The rain continued through the signing ceremony held in the county courthouse, the same building where Judge Harrison had tried to steal their inheritance before his own corruption had brought him down. This time the courtroom was filled with university representatives, legal teams, farmers who'd stood with the Garrett brothers through every battle, and media covering what had become a national story about David versus Goliath, translated into agricultural terms. Dr. Helen Parker stood at the front, explaining the consortium structure to reporters who were trying to understand how 12 major universities had pooled resources to save a single Kansas farm. Her academic language couldn't quite hide the revolutionary nature of what they'd accomplished, the way they'd turned corporate acquisition tactics on their head by creating a new model for protecting agricultural research in the public interest. This isn't charity, Parker emphasized, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd fought bureaucratic battles to make this happen. This is investment in our collective future. The Garrett Farm represents a living laboratory for developing climate-resistant crops that could prevent famines and food wars in the coming decades. The universities involved understand that some knowledge is too important to be controlled by profit motives. Sam sat beside Nate during the proceedings, his farmer's hands looking out of place against the polished wood of the courtroom benches, but there was pride in his bearing that hadn't been there a month ago. They'd saved the farm not by compromising or surrendering, but by fighting until people who mattered started paying attention. The victory felt earned in a way that simply inheriting property never would have. After the ceremony concluded and the legal documents were filed, creating the Garrett Agricultural Research Preserve, Vernon Mitchell approached the brothers with an envelope he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket. "Found this in your grandfather's things after the funeral," Vernon explained, his weathered hands steady as he passed the envelope to Nate. "Didn't seem like the right time to share it then, but now feels appropriate." The envelope was addressed to both brothers in their grandfather's distinctive handwriting, and inside was a letter dated just 2 weeks before Colonel James Garrett's death. "Nathan and Samuel," the letter began, "if you're reading this together, it means you've found a way past the divisions I worried would keep you apart. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive. Sorry I had to leave you puzzles instead of clear instructions. But some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived. The research you've inherited isn't just about seeds or farming techniques. It's about understanding that real wealth isn't measured in acres or bank accounts, but in the knowledge we preserve and share. Your father understood that, which is why they killed him. He wouldn't compromise what he believed was right, even when compromise would have been easier and safer. I made different choices after Daniel died. I chose silence over justice, chose protecting you boys over exposing the people who murdered my son. I've carried that shame for 18 years, wondering if my cowardice made me complicit in everything AgriCorp has done since. But I also chose to continue the work, to refine K7 generation by generation, believing that someday it might matter more than my desire for revenge. You've proven me right by fighting when I chose silence. You've honored your father's memory by refusing to compromise what you knew was right. And most importantly, you've demonstrated that the strongest legacy isn't land or research or even family name. It's the example we set for others about what's worth defending and what price we're willing to pay. The farm will face other threats in years to come. Corporate interests won't simply accept this defeat and move on to easier targets. They'll adapt, they'll find new strategies, they'll test your resolve in ways you can't anticipate. But you won't face those threats alone anymore. You've built something I never managed to build in 60 years of solitary research. You've built community. You've built trust. You've built a network of people who understand that standing together against systems designed to isolate us is the only way any of us survive. Take care of the land. Share what you learn. Remember that every seed planted is an act of faith in the future. And know that I'm proud of both of you, even though I didn't say it often enough while I could. Your grandfather, Colonel James Garrett. Nate's hands were shaking as he finished reading, and when he looked at Sam, he saw tears running down his brother's face. The kind of raw emotion that farmers train themselves not to show, but that demanded expression in moments that mattered. They stood together in the courthouse hallway while people moved past them, discussing legal details and research protocols. And for the first time since their father's death, they allowed themselves to grieve not just for what they'd lost, but for the burden their grandfather had carried alone for so long. The investigation into AgriCorp's activities accelerated in the weeks following the consortium agreement, fueled by Sullivan's testimony and the mountain of documentation Marcus Webb had provided to federal prosecutors. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit murder in Daniel Garrett's case, bribery of public officials, destruction of property, industrial sabotage, and a complex web of fraud related to how they'd acquired farmland through shell companies while misrepresenting their ownership to regulatory authorities. David Crenshaw was arrested at Kansas City Airport attempting to board a flight to a country without extradition treaties, his corporate confidence finally cracking when federal agents produced evidence linking him directly to the contractors who'd confronted the Garrett brothers at their irrigation system. His lawyer issued statements about fighting the charges, but recordings made by farmers on their phones during that confrontation made conviction seem inevitable. More significantly, the investigation expanded beyond Kansas to examine AgriCorp's activities in 17 other states, revealing a pattern of aggressive acquisition tactics that had destroyed dozens of family farms over 2 decades. Each new revelation generated more media coverage, more public outrage, and more political pressure to reform agricultural regulations that had allowed such predatory behavior to flourish. The spring planting season arrived with the farm under new management, but familiar hands working the soil. The consortium had hired Sam as operational director and Nathan as research coordinator, positions that formalized what they'd been doing anyway, but with salaries that meant they could afford to keep fighting whatever battles came next. More importantly, it meant the Garrett farm would continue as a working operation, rather than becoming some kind of agricultural museum, honoring their grandfather's belief that research and practical farming were inseparable. They planted K7 in the fields where their great-great-grandfather had first broken ground in 1891, where every generation since had worked the same soil and trusted the same seasonal rhythms. But this time they planted with the knowledge that seeds from this harvest would go to universities and farming cooperatives around the world, that the adaptive wheat their grandfather had refined over 60 years would help feed people in regions where conventional crops failed. Dr. Parker set up a permanent research station in the renovated equipment shed, bringing graduate students and postdocs who studied K7's genetic mechanisms and worked on developing similar drought-resistant varieties of other staple crops. The underground chamber that had hidden James Garrett's secrets became a teaching laboratory where students learned about long-term agricultural research and the ethics of knowledge sharing. Vernon Mitchell, despite his advanced age and the losses he'd suffered, became something of a celebrity among agricultural reformers, traveling to conferences to speak about community resistance to corporate consolidation. He'd rebuilt his equipment shed with insurance money and donations from farming associations who saw him as a symbol of everything worth preserving about rural American culture. 6 months after the consortium agreement was finalized, the trial of David Crenshaw and 3 AgriCorp executives began in federal court in Topeka. Nate and Sam both testified, describing the threats, the intimidation, the midnight confrontation that could have ended in their deaths if not for community intervention. The prosecution presented the kind of overwhelming evidence that made defense attorneys earn their fees, documentation and recordings, and witness testimony that painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business. The jury took less than 4 hours to return guilty verdicts on multiple counts. Crenshaw received 12 years in federal prison. The executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. AgriCorp itself was fined $800 million and placed under federal oversight that would monitor their agricultural acquisitions for the next decade. But the real victory, Nate reflected as he watched the verdicts being read, wasn't the prison sentences or the fines. It was the precedent being set, the message being sent to every corporate entity that saw farmers as obstacles to profit rather than stewards of essential resources. Some fights were worth having, even when the odds seemed impossible, because losing without fighting meant surrendering ground that could never be recovered. The anniversary of Colonel James Garrett's death arrived with the farm transformed but recognizable. Research stations and graduate students coexisting with tractors and livestock in the eternal cycle of planting and harvest. The family held a private memorial service at the cemetery, just Nate and Sam, and a few close friends gathering around the graves where 4 generations of Garretts rested in Kansas soil. Sam had brought the 1953 John Deere tiller, restored over months of careful work to full functionality, and they'd driven it to the cemetery as a kind of tribute to the grandfather who'd hidden his most important message in broken machinery. The tiller gleamed in the afternoon sun, its vintage green paint perfect, its mechanisms working as smoothly as they had 70 years ago when James Garrett had first brought it home. He knew we'd fix it, Sam said, running his hand along the machine's frame. Knew that what looked broken was just waiting for someone to care enough to make it work again. They stood in silence for a while, listening to wind move through the cemetery trees, and Nate thought about all the things his grandfather had fixed during his long life. The farm during the Depression, the research after the government abandoned it, the family after Daniel's death, and finally the relationship between 2 brothers who'd let distance and different choices drive them apart until crisis forced them back together. Marcus Webb had made the trip from Virginia for the memorial, the old colonel moving more slowly now, but still carrying himself with military bearing. He placed a folded flag at James's grave, a gesture of respect between soldiers who'd served together in causes both official and private. He was the best of us, Webb said simply. Understood that some battles are worth fighting even when you have to fight them alone. But he also understood that the greatest victories come when you convince others the fight matters enough to join you. That evening, back at the farm, they hosted a gathering that drew more than 200 people from across the county and beyond. Farmers and researchers, politicians and journalists, people whose lives had been changed by the Garrett. Families' refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming pressure. The equipment shed that had once hidden secrets now hosted celebration. Tables loaded with food brought by neighbors who understood that community was built through shared meals and shared struggles. Dr. Parker gave an update on K7's global distribution, showing maps where the drought-resistant wheat was now being tested in 12 countries across 4 continents. Early results suggested it could increase yields in arid regions by 40 to 60%, potentially preventing food shortages for millions of people. The research their grandfather had conducted in solitude was being refined and expanded by hundreds of scientists, becoming something larger than one man's vision. The congresswoman who'd made the Garrett farm a centerpiece of her agricultural policy platform attended with news that federal legislation was moving forward to create stronger protections for family farms against predatory acquisition practices. The bill was being called the Garrett Agricultural Protection Act, a name that would ensure Colonel James Garrett's legacy extended beyond research into the legal frameworks that govern land ownership and corporate behavior. As the gathering was winding down and guests were departing into a Kansas night that had finally learned to rain again, Nate found himself standing in the spot where his grandfather used to watch sunsets, the place where the old colonel had probably spent countless evenings thinking about secrets he couldn't share and wondering if his choices had been right. Sam joined him after seeing off the last of the visitors, and the brothers stood together in comfortable silence, something that would have been impossible 6 months ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. "You think Grandpa knew how this would turn out?" Sam asked. Nate considered the question, remembering the letter they'd found, the careful planning that had gone into hiding the research and creating puzzles that would bring them together rather than drive them further apart. "I think he hoped," Nate replied. "Hope is different from knowing. He couldn't predict whether we'd find the chamber or understand what K7 meant or have the courage to fight for it. But he gave us the tools we needed and trusted we'd figure out how to use them." "We almost didn't make it," Sam observed. "So many times when things could have gone the other way. But they didn't. And maybe that's what faith really means. Not certainty about outcomes, but trust that doing the right thing matters even when you can't see how it'll work out." The farm stretched out around them in the darkness, 280 acres that had been worked and protected and fought for across 6 generations, now secured not just for the Garrett family, but for a broader community of researchers and students and farmers who understood that some knowledge belonged to everyone. In the distance, lights glowed in the research station where graduate students were probably still working, studying seeds that represented promises to a future neither brothers would live to see, but that their grandfather's work had made possible. Nate thought about his father, killed for asking questions that threatened corporate profits. He thought about his grandfather, carrying the burden of that loss in silence for 18 years. He thought about all the farmers who'd lost their land, all the communities that had been hollowed out by consolidation and corporate efficiency, all the people who'd been told their way of life was obsolete and who should accept progress even when progress meant their destruction. And he thought about the alternative they'd created together, not by accepting what they were told was inevitable, but by fighting for what they believed was possible. Community over corporation, shared knowledge over proprietary control, faith that doing right mattered more than calculating odds. "I'm staying," Nate said, the decision that had been forming for months finally crystallizing into words. Resigning from the Department of Agriculture, making this permanent. Sam turned to look at his brother, surprise evident even in the darkness. "You sure you worked hard for that career?" "I worked hard for a career that felt meaningful," Nate corrected. Writing policy papers about agricultural sustainability while sitting in a Washington office stopped feeling meaningful the moment I saw what real farming looks like, what real community looks like when it decides to protect its own. This is where I'm supposed to be." Sam gripped his shoulder, the gesture containing everything that didn't need to be said about forgiveness and second chances, and the bonds that survived even when they were tested by distance and different choices. The next morning broke clear and cool, perfect weather for the work that farming demanded, regardless of corporate conspiracies or legal victories or personal revelations. Nate was up before dawn, moving through familiar routines that were becoming second nature again after 12 years away. Making coffee, checking weather reports, walking the fence lines to inspect for damage. He found Sam already in the barn, working on the tractor that would plant the next rotation of K7, and together they went through the mechanical rituals that had sustained farmers for generations. Checking oil levels, testing hydraulics, making small adjustments that could mean the difference between machinery that worked and machinery that failed in the middle of a field miles from help. "You know the hardest part about all of this," Sam said as they worked, "it's not the legal battles or the corporate threats or even the risk of losing the farm. It's knowing that Dad died for this and never got to see it matter. Never got to see K7 helping people around the world. Never got to see us working together again." Nate understood the sentiment, the particular grief that came from victories won too late for the people who'd made them possible. But he also understood something their grandfather had tried to teach them in his final letter. Dad saw it in potential, Nate offered. He saw what this could become when he chose to protect it instead of selling it, just like Grandpa saw it when he continued the research in secret for 60 years. They didn't need to see the outcome to know the fight was worth having. "You think they'd be proud, both of them?" "I think they'd be proud we figured out how to fight together instead of separately." That's what Grandpa wanted most. Not just protecting the research, but making sure his grandsons remembered they were stronger together than apart. The tractor engine turned over smoothly, the sound of properly maintained machinery that would do its job reliably if treated with respect and care. Sam climbed into the operator's seat, and Nate stood beside the barn door, watching his brother drive toward the fields where another generation of K7 would be planted, where the cycle of growth and harvest would continue regardless of human drama or corporate scheming. His phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Parker containing the latest research results from international field trials. The data was extraordinary, confirmation that K7 performed as well in Ethiopian highlands as it did in Kansas plains, that the adaptive mechanisms James Garrett had spent 60 years developing worked across climate zones and soil types and growing conditions. But more than the scientific validation, Parker's email included photographs from a farming cooperative in Kenya where K7 had been distributed through the open source network they'd created. The photos showed farmers standing in fields of wheat that shouldn't have been possible in that climate, holding stalks that represented the difference between subsistence and security, between hunger and hope. Nate stared at those photographs for a long time, thinking about connection and consequence, about how a decision made by a Kansas farmer in 1953 to smuggle seeds out of a terminated military program had led, through decades of patient work and stubborn faith, to food growing in African soil that had seemed too harsh to sustain it. The scale of impact was humbling. His grandfather hadn't just developed a wheat variety, he'd created a tool for human survival that would ripple outward through generations, helping people he'd never meet in places he'd never see. And he'd done it not for profit or recognition, but because he believed some knowledge was too important to be controlled by those who valued it only in market terms. That afternoon, Nate drove to the county recorder's office to file one final piece of paperwork, a document he'd been working on with Maria Chen for weeks. It was a conservation easement that would prevent the Garrett farm from ever being subdivided or developed, ensuring that regardless of what happened to the consortium or who eventually inherited the property, it would remain agricultural land in perpetuity. The document was his own act of faith in a future he wouldn't see, his own way of paying forward the legacy his grandfather had protected through decades of isolation and sacrifice. Future generations of Garretts or researchers or whoever worked this land would do so knowing that it had been preserved not for profit but for purpose. Dorothy Preston processed the paperwork with the same professional efficiency she'd shown when Sam filed the competing will months ago, but this time she smiled as she time-stamped the document. "Your grandfather would approve," she said simply, and Nate realized she'd probably known more about Colonel James Garrett's struggles than she'd ever let on. Small towns kept secrets until keeping them no longer served any purpose. And then those secrets became stories that explained how the present had been shaped by the past. The first harvest of K7 from the newly designated research preserve came in late summer, golden wheat standing tall despite the lingering effects of drought, demonstrating exactly the resilience that had made AgriCorp so desperate to control it. Combines moved through the fields with Sam at the controls, the rhythm of cutting and threshing and collecting following patterns that hadn't changed much despite the technology that automated what had once required dozens of hands. Nate worked the grain elevator, watching wheat pour into storage bins while calculating yields that exceeded projections even for K7's impressive specifications. This crop would feed the seed distribution network they'd established, providing starter quantities to cooperatives and universities and farming associations that had requested access to the research. But a portion would also go to the county food bank, a donation their grandfather had made every harvest for 40 years, and that they intended to continue. Feeding hungry people in their own community seemed like the appropriate foundation for work that aspired to feed hungry people worldwide. The harvest celebration that year drew nearly 500 people, the largest gathering the farm had ever hosted. They roasted a whole hog in a pit dug near the barn, served potato salad and corn and pies donated by neighbors who understood that community was built through shared abundance. Children ran through the yard playing games that had probably been played on this same ground for a century. Adults talked crops and weather and politics with the easy familiarity of people who saw each other regularly and whose lives were intertwined through proximity and shared challenges. Vernon Mitchell sat in a place of honor near the food tables, holding court with stories about farming in the old days when tractors were temperamental and rain was even less reliable than now. And Nate listened to the old farmers' tales, thinking about how knowledge was transmitted not just through written records, but through oral tradition, through stories that contained lessons disguised as entertainment. As evening approached and the gathering showed no signs of ending, Sam pulled Nate aside to the equipment shed where they'd spent so many hours planning strategy and fighting despair during the darkest moments of their struggle. "I've been thinking about next year," Sam said, "about expanding the research station, maybe bringing in more graduate students, really turning this into what Grandpa probably imagined it could be." "The consortium would support that," Nate agreed. "Parker's been talking about making this a model for how agricultural research can be conducted in partnership with working farms rather than just in laboratories." "It's strange," Sam observed. 6 months ago, we were fighting to keep the farm at all. Now we're planning to expand it, turn it into something bigger than just our family legacy. That's what Grandpa wanted, though, for it to matter beyond us, for the work to continue and grow and help as many people as possible." Sam nodded, his gaze moving across the celebration visible through the shed's open doors. "You know what I realized? All those years I resented you for leaving, I was wrong, not because you shouldn't have left, but because I thought we had to choose between different paths. Stay or go, farm or study. But Grandpa's real lesson was that we needed both. Someone who stayed to maintain the work and someone who left to understand how it fit into larger systems. Took us a while to figure that out, Nate admitted. Better late than not at all. They rejoined the celebration as the sun set over fields that had been worked and protected and fought for through 6 generations of Garrett family history. Music started up, someone with a fiddle and another with a guitar playing songs that had probably been played at harvest celebrations for 100 years. People danced in the yard between the house and barn, their movements carving joy out of the same space where federal agents and corporate representatives had once gathered with darker purposes. Nate found himself dancing with Sarah Chen, Maria Chen's daughter who'd driven out from Topeka with her mother for the celebration. She was studying agricultural law at the University of Kansas, inspired by the Garrett case to pursue a career defending family farms against predatory corporate practices. They talked about legal strategies and policy reforms while moving through the dance, and Nate thought about how victories rippled outward in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled, inspiring others to fight their own battles. Later, as the celebration was winding down and people were departing into a Kansas night that had learned to be generous with rain, Nate climbed to the second floor of the farmhouse and entered his childhood bedroom. It looked different now that he'd moved back permanently, his belongings from Washington integrated with the artifacts of his youth, creating a space that acknowledged both who he'd been and who he was becoming. He pulled out the letter his grandfather had left, the one Vernon had delivered on the day the consortium agreement was finalized, and read it again slowly, looking for meanings he might have missed in earlier readings. Take care of the land, share what you learn. Remember that every seed planted is an act of faith in the future. Simple instructions that contained multitudes. His grandfather had understood that the work didn't end with developing K7 or even distributing it globally. The work was ongoing, a commitment that each generation had to renew through their own choices and sacrifices. Nate went to the window and looked out across the farm, seeing lights in the research station where students were probably still working, seeing the outlines of the barn and equipment shed and the fields that stretched beyond them into darkness. This land had sustained his family for 6 generations, and now it would sustain research that could help sustain the world. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead Nate felt something else. Not burden, but purpose. Not obligation, but opportunity. His grandfather had given them more than seeds or research or even a farm. He'd given them a blueprint for how knowledge could be protected and shared, for how community could resist systems designed to isolate and exploit, for how faith in the future could be made manifest through present action. 6 months later, on a morning when spring was preparing to transition into summer and the farm was preparing for another planting season, Nate received a package from Marcus Webb. Inside was a photograph he'd never seen before, showing Colonel James Garrett and a young Marcus Webb standing in a wheat field at Fort Riley in 1952, both wearing Army uniforms and holding stalks of what must have been the very first generation of K7. The photo was labeled on the back in Webb's handwriting, "The day we thought we were preparing for the end of the world." We didn't realize we were creating its salvation. But there was also a note from Webb, written on his personal stationery. "Nathan, I wanted you to have this photograph because it represents the moment your grandfather's real work began. Not the military research or the government program, but the decision one man made to continue pursuing knowledge, even after official support disappeared. That photograph captures the last day James was working for someone else's agenda. After that, he was working for his own vision of what agriculture could be. I'm 93 now, too old for much beyond memories and correspondence. But I wanted you to know that watching you and your brother fight for James's legacy gave me something I'd lost decades ago. Hope. Not the vague optimism that things might work out, but the concrete evidence that resistance to corruption and greed is still possible, that communities can still organize to protect what matters. Your grandfather would be proud of what you've built. More importantly, he'd be grateful that his faith in future generations was justified. Take care of the farm, take care of each other, and remember that every act of resistance, no matter how small it seems, contributes to larger movements toward justice. Your grandfather's friend, Marcus Webb. Nate placed the photograph on his desk beside the other artifacts he'd collected since returning to the farm. His grandfather's journals, seed samples from early K7 generations, the brass key to the underground chamber, the letter explaining why the tiller mattered. Each object represented a piece of the story that had brought him home and given his life the purpose he'd been searching for in Washington without knowing what he was looking for. The spring planting began under clear skies and with soil that had finally recovered from the long drought. Moisture levels restored by months of regular rain that felt like the land exhaling after holding its breath too long. Sam drove the tractor pulling the seed planter that Nate had helped prepare, and together they worked the fields in patterns that connected them to every previous generation that had done this same work on this same ground. Graduate students from the research station came out to help, young people from across the country and around the world who'd been drawn to the Garrett farm by the story of resistance and the promise of participating in research that mattered. They asked questions about planting depth and seed spacing, about soil composition and moisture management, learning the practical applications of theories they'd studied in classrooms. Nate taught them what his grandfather had taught him and what his father had taught his grandfather. Knowledge transmitted across generations through demonstration and practice. But he also learned from them, discovering new ways of thinking about old problems, finding that education was a dialogue rather than a monologue when both parties approached it with humility. That evening, exhausted from the physical labor of planting, but satisfied in ways that office work had never provided, Nate and Sam stood in the field watching the sun set over freshly planted ground. Beneath the surface, K7 seeds were beginning the process that would transform them from potential into actuality, drawing water and nutrients from soil that had been carefully prepared to receive them. Every seed planted is an act of faith in the future, Nate said, repeating his grandfather's words. Sam nodded, understanding. Think they'll remember us? The people 100 years from now who might benefit from this? Probably not, Nate admitted. But I don't think that's the point. Grandpa didn't do this for recognition. He did it because it needed to be done, and he was one of the few people positioned to do it. We're just continuing work that started before us and will continue after us. That's a kind of immortality, though, isn't it? Being part of something that outlasts you? Nate considered this, watching light fade from the sky and stars begin to emerge. The same stars that had guided his great-great-grandfather when he first broke this ground in 1891, that had watched over every generation since as they planted and harvested and held on to this land through circumstances that would have broken weaker families. Maybe, he agreed, or maybe immortality is the wrong goal. Maybe what matters is knowing we did something that mattered while we were here. They walked back toward the farmhouse as darkness completed its daily conquest of the sky. Two brothers who'd been strangers 6 months ago, but who'd become partners through shared crisis and shared purpose. Behind them, the fields waited for germination, for the emergence of plants that represented hope in the form of genetic adaptation and human persistence. The Garrett farm would continue its work through seasons yet to come, protecting knowledge and demonstrating that agriculture could be both profitable and principled, that research could serve community rather than corporate interests, that families who'd worked land for generations deserved to keep working it when they chose to stand and fight. And somewhere in soil that ranged from Kansas to Kenya, from American plains to Asian highlands, K7 seeds were taking root, proving that one man's 60 years of patient work could ripple outward to touch lives he'd never know in places he'd never see. Colonel James Garrett had planted those seeds literally and metaphorically, had nurtured them through decades when surrender would have been easier, had protected them until the right people inherited both the research and the responsibility it represented. Now that harvest was spreading across the world, feeding not just bodies but the faith that knowledge shared was stronger than knowledge hoarded, that communities standing together were more powerful than corporations standing alone, that some legacies were measured not in property or profit but in lives touched and futures made possible. The seeds of deception had been exposed and destroyed. What grew in their place was something his grandfather had spent a lifetime cultivating. Hope, rooted deep in earth that had been worked by honest hands and watered by the faith that doing right mattered more than calculating odds. And in Kansas, where autumn would eventually give way to winter and winter to spring, in the eternal cycle that farmers knew better than anyone, that hope would continue growing season after season, generation after generation, for as long as people remembered that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost.